Somewhere in the world right now, there is a field, flat, unremarkable, maybe covered in wheat or scrub grass or slow-moving cattle. And underneath it, 30 feet down, compressed into the kind of silence only centuries can produce, there might be evidence of people who lived full lives, raised children, told stories, feared the dark, and loved certain places the way we love ours. Or there might be nothing at all, that's the thing. We can't always tell. And that gap between what happened and what survives is one of the most quietly astonishing puzzles in all of human history. Think about this. Modern humans have existed for somewhere around 300,000 years. Maybe longer. But the written record, the part where we actually have documents and texts and things people deliberately left behind for others to read, that goes back maybe 5,000 years. 5,000 out of 300,000, that's less than 2% of the whole story. The other 98% is what we're talking about tonight. 30,000 years of the most recent prehistory alone, a period when humans were painting caves, navigating coastlines, taming fire, crossing continents, and building the first foundations of everything we'd eventually become, left behind a record so patchy and fragile that most of it might as well be silence. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check every comment. It's Sydney at sunrise and Sao Paulo just past midnight, all in the same thread. That never stops being strange and wonderful to me. Now, when I say almost no trace, I don't mean nothing. There are traces, cave paintings in southern France that stopped time 40,000 years ago. Stone tools so well made they feel almost intentional even now. Fragments of bone with cut marks, teeth, seeds, ash. The occasional miracle of a preserved body in a peat bog or a glacier, staring back at us across millennia with startling specificity. These things exist, but they are the exceptions, the flukes, the lucky accidents of geology and chemistry, and sheer dumb preservation. They are not the rule. For every object that survived, thousands didn't. For every site we've found, hundreds more are probably gone forever, or buried under cities, or sitting on the floor of a sea that didn't used to be there. And here's where it gets interesting. The things that lasted are not necessarily the things that mattered most. This is what archaeologists sometimes call survivorship bias. Stone survives, wood mostly doesn't, ceramic lasts. Leather vanishes. The hard, the dense, the mineralized, these things make it through. But most of what people actually used every day, the baskets, the nets, the hides, the wooden bowls, the woven clothing, the rope, the bark containers, the carved handles, the sleeping mats, all of that is gone. Completely, irreversibly gone. We've been building our picture of ancient life almost entirely from the durable exceptions, while the perishable majority, which was probably the heart of daily existence, has left almost no footprint whatsoever. So what erased it all? That's part of what will follow tonight. Water is one of the great deleters. Rivers migrate. Floodplains bury and then re-expose, and then rebury sites over thousands of years, grinding evidence into fragments too small to mean anything. Ice scraped entire landscapes clean during the glacial periods, and then retreated, leaving behind rearranged geology that can look deceptively empty. When the ice ages ended and sea levels rose by hundreds of feet, vast coastal regions where enormous numbers of people almost certainly lived were simply swallowed. Gone under water that's now too deep and too cold and too difficult to search systematically. Add microbes quietly breaking down anything organic. Add time itself, the slow compression and chemical transformation of buried layers. Add humans who have been reusing good building stone and fertile ground and defensible hilltops for so long that the earlier layers beneath current settlements are often pulverized or contaminated beyond easy interpretation. The question that sits underneath all of this, the one we'll keep returning to across the whole journey tonight, is this. If most of human life was made of perishable things, lived in perishable places, remembered through perishable stories told out loud and never written down, how do we reconstruct any of it? How do we hear people who left no texts and whose objects mostly turn to soil? How do we find the signal in so much silence? The answer, it turns out, involves satellites reading shadows from orbit, isotopes locked inside single teeth, ancient DNA pulled from sediment where no bone was found, and underwater robots mapping drowned coastlines that were dry ground when people walked them. It involves listening very carefully to what little did survive and being honest about what that selection means for everything we think we know. The history of deep human time is not a story told by its main characters. It's reconstructed from the margins, from what the Earth held on to almost by accident. And that makes it one of the most genuinely uncertain, genuinely surprising, genuinely humbling areas of knowledge we have. Let's follow it together. So let's start with the basic question. What exactly are we looking for when we look for ancient people? Archaeologists divide what survives into a few broad categories. Artifacts are the things people made and used, tools, ornaments, containers, weapons. Features are things that can't easily be moved. A hearth, a post hole, a buried floor, a pit where someone stored food or disposed of the dead. Ecofacts are the biological remains that weren't deliberately made, but ended up in the record anyway. Seeds, pollen, animal bones with butchery marks, snail shells, fish scales, insect remains from inside grain stores. And then there are human remains themselves, bones, teeth, occasionally soft tissue when the conditions were extraordinary. Finally, there's the landscape, the shape of the ground itself, terraces, field systems, pathways worn into bedrock by generations of feet, middens that raised the earth slightly over millennia of accumulated shell and bone. All of these are traces. But here's the thing that took archaeologists a long time to fully reckon with. Not all of them survive equally, not even close. There's a whole branch of science dedicated to understanding why. It's called taphonomy, and it studies the processes that transform things after they're deposited. The word comes from the Greek for burial and lore, and the discipline is essentially about understanding the rules by which the material world gets slowly destroyed, moved or disguised. A bone dropped on a surface faces an immediate gauntlet. Scavengers can scatter it, roots can crack it, water can carry it downstream. Acid soils can dissolve it entirely within a few centuries, leaving nothing. Freeze-thaw cycles can shatter it into fragments too small to identify. The same bone buried quickly in alkaline sediment in a dry cave can last 100,000 years and still tell you the age, sex, diet, and disease history of the person it belonged to. Same object, completely different fate. Two possible outcomes separated by geology and luck. This is why the archaeological record is so deeply, structurally uneven. Preservation is not random, it's biased. Heavily biased towards certain materials in certain environments. Stone survives almost everywhere, and almost always. Fired clay, once it's been through a kiln or a cooking fire hot enough to transform its chemistry, can persist for tens of thousands of years. Certain metals, gold especially, survive beautifully because they don't react with most of what's in the ground. But wood, leather, fibre, plant matter, most bone in most soils, painted surfaces on anything that isn't rock, all of that degrades. Some of it quickly, some of it over centuries. But the trend is relentless, and the end point is nothing. So when we look at the record of any ancient period, we are not seeing a fair sample of what existed. We are seeing the hard, the dense, the chemically stable, and we are missing almost everything else. It's as if you tried to reconstruct a modern city after thousands of years, but all that survived was the concrete foundations, some plumbing, a few coins, and a handful of glass bottles. The computers and the cars and the clothing and the books and the music and the food and the faces would all be gone. You could infer certain things, but you would be dangerously tempted to see a simpler, poorer, less interesting world than the one that actually existed. That temptation is something archaeologists have to actively resist every single day. There's another problem that compounds this: time compression. When you look at a cross-section of excavated earth, you're looking at layers. Each layer is a period of time, but those layers are not evenly distributed. A single spectacular event, a flood, a volcanic eruption, a building collapse, can deposit meters of sediment in days. Meanwhile, 1,000 years of normal human activity with no dramatic events, just people living and moving and not staying long enough to build much, might leave a layer a few millimeters thick, or might leave nothing identifiable at all. 1,000 years can look like a thin smear, or a blank gap that makes it seem like no one was there. When you see what appears to be empty centuries in the record, you have to ask whether that emptiness reflects real absence or just the absence of the conditions needed for preservation. These are genuinely different things. Then there's the problem of where we've been looking. Archaeology is a formal discipline developed in Europe and the Near East, and for a long time the questions being asked, and the places being excavated, reflected that origin. Sites were investigated where texts mentioned them. Monuments were excavated because they were visible and dramatic. Caves were explored because caves preserve well. This created a feedback loop. The sites that got excavated yielded evidence. The evidence reinforced assumptions about where ancient people lived and what they were doing. And the regions where nobody was looking, vast stretches of sub-Saharan Africa, Amazonia, the Pacific, the interior of Central Asia, much of Southeast Asia, seemed emptier than they probably were. All were described as simpler, less complex, less worth investigating. That's sampling bias, and it has shaped our picture of the past in ways we're still untangling. The areas of the world that have been most intensively excavated do not necessarily correspond to the areas where the most people lived. They correspond to where archaeologists happen to work, where funding was available, where political access was possible, where existing theories suggested looking. What this means is that our map of ancient human activity is full of bright spots and dark zones, and the dark zones are not evidence of emptiness. They are evidence of incomplete searching, which brings us to the most important thing to hold in your mind as we move through this whole topic. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's a phrase worth sitting with. When we say there's no trace of something in the record, we need to ask several questions before concluding it didn't exist. Was the material the kind that could survive? Was the environment one that favours preservation? Has anyone actually looked there? Have we looked with the right tools? Even when the answer to all of those is a careful maybe, the absence might still be meaningful. But the caution has to come first, because the history of archaeology is full of things that were declared absent and then found. Complex societies in regions that were assumed to be too challenging for them. Long-distance trade networks connecting peoples who were thought to have lived in isolation. Symbolic behaviour appearing tens of thousands of years earlier than the theories predicted. Again and again, absence turned out to mean not yet found. And every time we expand our methods or our search areas, the past gets denser, richer, more complicated, more populated with people who were doing things we hadn't credited them with. There's something almost vertiginous about this if you stay with it. The past we know is the past that happened to leave durable material in places we happen to search with methods capable of detecting it. That's a very narrow slice of actual human experience. Everything else is filtered out by chemistry, by time, by geography, by the history of the discipline itself. The filter is real, and it's powerful, and being aware of it changes the way you hear everything that comes after. So, when you picture ancient people in the deep past, try to resist the image of sparse populations doing simple things in nearly empty landscapes. That image comes from the filter, not necessarily from the reality. The reality was probably loud with language and rich with objects we'll never see, and complex with relationships that left no stone or clay record. We're listening through very thick walls, and every so often something gets through, and it's extraordinary precisely because so much didn't make it. The traces that survived are not the whole story. They're the parts the Earth decided to keep. To see why the record is so thin in some periods, you have to imagine the world our species spent most of its life in, not farms and villages, not cities and roads, an Ice Age world. For the last 100,000 years before farming, global climate was not gently drifting toward the present. It was swinging, huge, fast changes by geological standards. Ice sheets advancing and retreating across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels rising and falling by tens of meters. Forests spreading over regions that had been cold grassland a few centuries before, then shrinking back as the climate flipped again. On the ground, where people actually lived, this meant instability. A valley rich in game and edible plants when you were a child might be drier and poorer by the time you had grandchildren. A river that was reliable for 3 generations might shift its course or dry seasonally. Herds of animals followed these changes, moving along new migration routes as vegetation belts crept north or south. And people who depended on those herds and those plants moved with them. This is one of the quiet truths behind the Great Silence. Most humans, for most of our species' existence, were not building permanent settlements for archaeologists to find. They were adjusting, season by season, to landscapes that would not sit still. Think of late Pleistocene Africa or Ice Age Eurasia as mosaics, patches of forest, grassland, marsh, steppe, desert, all shifting their edges with each climatic pulse. People learned where the productive patches were in a given year, and they built their lives around moving between them. Dry season here, wet season there, summer up in the hills, winter down in the sheltered valleys. A loop, not a dot. When your life is a loop like that, you do not pour labour into heavy, immovable things. You do not build thick stone walls unless you know you will be there long enough for your grandchildren's grandchildren to use them. You don't cut and set huge timbers for a house if you plan to move camp in a few weeks. Instead, you travel light. That's the core reason mobile Ice Age groups leave such a faint material shadow. Their architecture, if we use that word at all, was mostly temporary. Frames of wood or bone, hides stretched over poles, windbreaks made from brush or stacked turf, sleeping platforms of grass, storage pits that were used for a season or two and then left, fireplaces scraped out, used, cleaned, used again, and eventually abandoned to wind and rain. These things are real. They were homes, however temporary. They sheltered laughter and arguments and songs and births and deaths. But their physical traces are fragile. A hide shelter taken down when the group moves on leaves only a ring of post holes and a slightly compacted patch of ground. Give that a few thousand years of freeze and thaw, root growth, burrowing animals, flood water, and the signal becomes faint. Give it 30,000, and in most places it disappears into the general noise of the soil. Archaeologists, when they are lucky, find the ghosts of these camps. A cluster of stones that were once a hearth, reddened by fire. A scattering of flint flakes where someone sat and knapped a tool. A thin layer of charcoal preserved under a rock overhang. A concentration of animal bones with cut marks, hinting at a butchery spot. No streets, no foundations, just patterns, a slight density of artifacts where, briefly, humans stopped. It helps to distinguish between a campsite and a settlement. A campsite is an event. A few nights, a few weeks, maybe a season. You build with what's to hand and with an eye to moving on. A settlement is a decision to stay. You invest in durable features, storage pits lined with stone, post holes cut deep for sturdy structures, maybe even ditches or fences. Settlements, even modest ones, punched deeper holes into the archaeological record. For most of the late Pleistocene, what we mostly had was campsites. Some returned to year after year, turning into what archaeologists call persistent places. But even there, the accumulation was spread across centuries, in light, intermittent layers that erosion could easily rearrange. Then add demographics on top of this. Even at their most successful, Ice Age hunting and gathering groups could not heap people onto the land the way farming later would. Wild resources have limits. Large game animals take years to reach breeding age. Plants produce seeds in particular seasons under particular conditions. If a group tried to increase its numbers too far, too fast, local resources would crash. So human population densities remained low, not just in the glacial north, but across much of the planet. One small band of maybe 20 to 50 individuals might range over hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers. Another band would occupy the next territory over, and between them, long stretches of landscape might be used very lightly, or only at particular times of year. This is where those earlier bottlenecks matter. There were times, as we saw, when global human numbers fell to the low thousands. Even after recovery, growth was gradual. The entire population of Europe in some Ice Age periods might have been no more than a medium-sized modern town, spread out over an entire continent. If you picture a continent that size with that few people on it, you start to understand why it can look empty in the archaeological record. There simply weren't that many camps to leave behind, and of those only a tiny fraction ended up in places where conditions favoured long-term preservation. Of that tiny fraction, only a handful have been noticed, investigated, and published. This is absence piling on absence, low population density, light material culture, fragile structures, and brutal taphonomic filters all working together to erase most traces of daily life. Even within that erased world, people were not helpless wanderers. They had toolkits that were surprisingly rich. But again, most of it was built for movement. Stone tools catch our attention because they survive. A late Pleistocene toolkit laid out fresh on a skin would look very different. Stone would be just the sharp and durable core buried inside a much larger organic package. Imagine what's missing: wooden spear shafts and throwing sticks, bows and arrows with wooden bodies and sinew strings, bone needles, antler wedges, digging sticks hardened in the fire, cordage from plant fibres or animal sinews, nets and snares and fish traps, woven from materials that rot quickly, bags and slings and belts made of leather, baskets for collecting seeds and tubers. All of this would have been standard equipment in a mobile world. Most of it is gone. A stone point survives on its own and looks simple, but in life it was half of a composite object, carefully hafted with glue and bindings to a shaped shaft, made to be repaired, retipped, carried across long distances. The knowledge bound up in that composite technology is far greater than the surviving flake suggests. So we have people spread thin over a restless landscape, carrying portable, mostly perishable gear, sleeping under shelters designed to vanish. That would be enough to explain a very quiet record. But the silence is uneven, patchy. Some regions of the Ice Age world glow with sites and artifacts. Others seem nearly blank. That contrast has its own story. Part of it is geology. Caves, rock shelters, and loess plains, the fine wind-blown sediments that blanket parts of Europe and China, are excellent at preserving evidence. They protect delicate materials from sun and rain. Their stable temperatures slow decay. They trap layers, one atop another, instead of letting them wash away. It's no accident that so much of what we know about Ice Age people comes from these special environments. Other landscapes are less kind. Tropical forests, with their warm, wet, acidic soils, dissolve bone and wood quickly. Open plains, subjected to repeated cycles of erosion and deposition, can strip away entire surfaces where camps once stood. Mountain slopes slump and slide. River floodplains bury and rework their sediments again and again. A campsite laid down there is like writing on a beach between tides. Another part of the patchiness is us. Regions with long traditions of archaeological work, Europe, parts of the Near East, certain zones in East Asia and North America, have been combed over for generations. Surveyed, excavated, re-excavated. Their Ice Age sites have been sought, mapped, argued over. Other vast regions, including much of interior Africa, parts of Siberia, large stretches of South America and swathes of Southeast Asia, have seen far less systematic searching for Pleistocene traces. Political instability, dense vegetation, lack of roads, limited funding, or simple historical oversight have kept research effort low. The apparent emptiness there may reflect not the movements of ancient people, but the movements of modern archaeologists. So, when we talk about Ice Age worlds leaving light footprints, it's a compound effect. Mobile people following shifting ecologies, small populations spread over immense territories, toolkits built around organic materials that rot, campsites that were never meant to last, landscapes that erase, bury, or scramble what little was left, and a research history that has focused intensely on some fortunate areas of good preservation while barely touching others. If you hold all of that at once, the great silence of 30,000 years looks less like a mystery and more like an expectation. The real surprise is not how little we see, but that we see anything at all. And yet, even that faint record points to something else, something even larger that's mostly missing. Those perishable worlds of wood and fibre and hide, the bulk of what people actually lived with. To understand just how much has vanished, we have to turn to the materials that almost never survive. If you could walk into a camp from 30,000 years ago, you might feel a strange kind of vertigo, because it would not look like the stone museum our excavations suggest. It would look soft, wood, leather, fibre, fur, woven, knotted, stitched, bent into shape. The hard, glittering stone blades would be there, but mostly as edges, the teeth in a much larger body made entirely of things that rot. Everyday life, for almost all of human history, was built on materials that are almost perfectly designed to disappear. Start with clothing. The Ice Age stereotype is a single rough fur pelt thrown over the shoulders, but the reality was probably far more complex. Layered outfits tailored to fit, sewn with bone needles and fine thread from sinew or twisted plant fibre. Parkas with hoods, mittens, boots with insulated soles. Rain capes made from oiled skins, in warmer regions, skirts, tunics, belts, headbands, perhaps even decorative fringe and embroidery. We almost never see those garments. What we have instead are hints. Wear on bones in the shoulders and elbows that match the repeated motions of sewing. Microscopic polish on bone needles showing where thread slid through the eye. Traces of ochre and other pigments on pendant stones and beads that were probably sewn into clothing now gone. Frozen mummies from much later periods, their layered outfits showing what complex clothing traditions can look like when they do, by some miracle, survive. Then think about containers. You can't live a mobile life without ways to carry things. Baskets for seeds, nuts and tubers, plaited packs, woven bags slung over shoulders or across the back, skin bags sewn and greased for waterproofing, small pouches for pigments, medicines, charms and tools. Children swaddled and carried in slings, water bladders, maybe even folded bark containers. In an ordinary temperate landscape, all of that becomes soil within a few decades or centuries at most. The only sign that they ever existed might be a tiny patch of soil slightly richer in certain minerals, or the ghosts of impressions left where a basket sat in damp sediment and imprinted its weave before the fibres vanished. Fishing and trapping gear were just as ephemeral. Nets made from twisted plant fibres or sinew, snares set along game trails, fish traps built from woven sticks and stakes, lines and hooks, weighted nets for birds, deadfall triggers carved from twigs. All of these could be elaborately designed, carefully maintained, passed down as knowledge. What survives? A few stone or bone sinkers, abrasive wear on stones used as net weights, grooves worn into antler or wood handles where cord once bit. In some waterlogged or frozen sites we are lucky, perfectly preserved nets from later prehistory, each knot still in place, revealing a mastery of fibre technology that must reach far back beyond the few surviving examples. Wood was everywhere. We usually talk about stone tools, but in most cases the stone was just the sharp part on the end of something wooden. Spear shafts cut, straightened in the steam of a fire, and polished smooth. Throwing sticks balanced to fly flat, digging sticks fire-hardened at the tip. Club heads carved and perhaps decorated. Bow staves carefully seasoned so they would not warp or snap. Arrow shafts fletched with feathers, handles for scrapers, knives and chopping tools. Almost none of that wood is left from 30,000 years ago. Only under exceptional conditions does it endure, deep in cold caves, sealed in oxygen-free bogs, entombed in desert sand, frozen in permafrost, pickled in salt. In these rare places the curtain lifts a little. We find spear shafts still bearing the slight marks of scraping tools. Wooden bowls and ladles, fragments of sled runners and skis from later periods. Walking sticks, the occasional carved figurine. Each piece is a reminder that the Stone Age is a label we invented by looking only at what's left. The world of adhesives and bindings is even more invisible. To haft a stone point to a spear, you need more than wood and rock. You need glue. Resins from trees heated and mixed with charcoal or ochre to make them tougher. Birch tar carefully distilled in low oxygen fires. Plant gums, animal glues from boiled bone or hide. You need cordage too, strips of rawhide twisted into rope. Thin cords spun from nettle or flax or bark fibre. Braided sinew, complex knots and lashings, the ancestors of every rope trick on a sailing ship. We very rarely see the glue or the cord. What we see under a microscope are residues, a tiny smear of fossilized tar in the hafting groove of a stone point, a blackened trace along the edge of a scraper, chemical signatures in the soil showing once sticky plant resins. Microscopic plant fibres trapped in the polish on a stone tool where it was used to strip bark or twist strands together. This is where indirect evidence becomes our stand-in for all the things that have vanished. A stone blade with one kind of wear polish and a certain pattern of edge damage might mean meat cutting. Another, with different polish and tiny silica particles from plants, tells us it was used on grasses or reeds. A ground groove on a stone might be from grinding pigment, or from sharpening wooden stakes, or from twisting cord over and over in the same place. Residues under chemical analysis can show traces of fat, blood, plant sap, or even specific species of trees, giving us glimpses of what was being cut, scraped, or glued. In some sites, impressions are all we have left. Clay hearth linings with the faint pattern of woven baskets pressed into them, mud brick surfaces with the outlines of mats or woven floors, the imprint of a textile in a burial, the cloth long gone, but its texture printed in mineral salts that grew around it. From these ghosts, archaeologists try to rebuild the full world. Experimental archaeology adds another layer. People today, using stone, bone, and wood, try to recreate the tools and techniques that would have made sense in those environments. They learn how long it takes to spin fibre into cord, and how strong it is. They try to make birch tar without metal containers. They haft stone points onto shafts with different recipes of glues and bindings, then test them by throwing them or shooting them into carcasses to see what breaks, what holds, and what kinds of wear it leaves. These experiments don't prove that ancient people did things in exactly that way, but they show what is possible, how efficient certain designs can be, and what kinds of microscopic traces different activities leave behind. When archaeologists then see those same traces on ancient tools, they can connect them to likely behaviours. From this combined work, a different picture of past technology emerges. Instead of a handful of simple stone tools, we begin to see complex composite objects, a backed blade set into a wooden handle with resin and sinew used as a knife, a spear with a carefully thinned stone tip, bound in place so that it could be replaced quickly, a fishing kit with bone hooks, fibre lines, and little stone weights, a basketry tradition with dozens of weave patterns, each suited to different loads. Once you see that, the stone part of Stone Age starts to feel like a bias. We call it the Stone Age, not because stone was the most important material, but because stone is what survives best. If wood and fibre and hide preserved as easily as flint, we might talk instead about the Basket Age, or the Rope Age, or the Age of Skin. For 30,000 years and more, what mattered most to people was often precisely what the earth is least likely to keep: warmth, flexibility, lightness, portability. A child's fur-lined cradle, a sling that could drop a deer at a distance, a net that could feed a camp in a single lucky haul of fish, a set of sturdy bags that let a whole family move their world in an afternoon. When we stare at a row of stone points in a museum drawer, we are looking at the bones of that world without its flesh. The silence in the record is not just an absence of sights. It is an absence of material categories: clothing, containers, woven things, wooden frameworks, sticky, stretchy, braided, knotted technologies that made life possible. Only in special environments, deserts where decay slows, waterlogged bogs with no oxygen, salty caves, permanently frozen ground, does the balance shift, and suddenly we get a flood of perishable artifacts from a brief window of time. They are so richly detailed that they can feel anomalous, like miracles. But they are probably closer to normality than the bare stone scatters we usually see. Those rare sights are like turning up the volume on a song that has been playing all along, too quietly to hear. They remind us that what we think of as simple societies were built on dense, sophisticated knowledge of how to work fragile materials that time does not respect. And this, in turn, changes how we read the landscapes themselves. Because if your core technologies are soft and biodegradable, then the forces that erase them, water, wind, soil movement, become not just background noise, but active editors of the past. To understand how much has really been lost, we have to look next at those editors, the rivers that move the ground itself, the slopes that slip, the surfaces that come and go, the processes that take perishable civilizations and, grain by grain, carry them away. Imagine you've built your whole life out of things designed to rot, and then you set them down on ground that isn't even staying still. That's the world our ancestors lived in. The earth under their feet was not a stage, fixed and waiting, but a slow-moving machine. It grinds, carries, buries and rearranges, and while it's doing that, it is quietly editing the archaeological record, deciding what stays close enough to the surface for us to find, and what gets shredded, drowned, or sunk out of reach. Erosion and sedimentation are the two basic moves in this machine. Erosion is removal, wind, rain, waves, ice and gravity, all picking at the surface, lifting away grains of soil and sand, carrying them downslope or downstream. Over years and centuries, a little nick in a hillside becomes a gully, then a ravine. A gentle slope becomes a scarred face of exposed rock and loose rubble. Sedimentation is the opposite. It's where all that removed material ends up, in floodplains, in lake bottoms, in deltas and coastal shallows. Layer after layer of silt and sand and mud settle, one thin sheet at a time, stacking up and quietly burying whatever happens to be beneath them. For archaeology, both processes are double-edged. Imagine a camp on a low riverbank 30,000 years ago. A ring of hearths, post holes from shelters, a scattering of bone fragments and broken tools. Maybe a child's lost bead, a discarded needle, a mat woven from reeds. If erosion dominates, years of floods and high water might eat away at that bank, slice directly into the living floor, and simply carry it off. Hearths collapse into the river, bones float, then sink and dissolve or get ground up. The needles and beads roll along the bottom until they are lost in gravel bars far downstream. What remains on the bank may be nothing, or a few stone chips from tool-making that happen to lie slightly farther inland. If sedimentation dominates, the opposite happens. A big flood smothers the camp in a sheet of silt. Later floods add more in time. That old occupation surface lies 2, 3, 10 meters below a flat, quiet field. The village itself is gone. The posts rotted. The hides and wood collapsed. But splinters of bone, broken tools, charcoal and stains in the soil might still be sitting there, sealed in a kind of geological time capsule. From the surface you'd never know. For every site that has been stripped away grain by grain, another has been wrapped in blankets of sediment and hidden so deeply that only a lucky construction trench, a river cutting a new course, or an expensive targeted excavation will ever reveal it. Rivers are some of the most aggressive editors of all. We often imagine them as blue lines staying politely inside their banks. Real rivers wander. Over centuries, a river on a floodplain can swing back and forth, slicing into one bank while building up another. It loops, forms, bends, cuts off meanders, abandons old channels and carves new ones. To a group of hunter-gatherers or early farmers, these shifting rivers were magnets. Water, fish, birds, fertile soils, easy travel. Camps, villages and fields clustered along their margins. To the archaeological record, that's a problem. When a river swings into an old terrace, it can carve straight through layers of past occupation like a knife through cake. One bank might show a perfect cross-section, soil, an old living floor, buried hearths, more soil above. The opposite bank, where the cut has gone deeper, might show nothing at all. The ancient site is simply gone, washed downstream. When the river swings away, it leaves behind old channels full of sand and mud. Over these people build new camps. Then, centuries later, the river swings back, tears into those deposits, and dumps pieces of them somewhere else entirely. A hearth from one village might be eroded away and redeposited as a jumbled cluster of charcoal and stone flakes in a sandbar miles away from where people actually lived. From our end, thousands of years later, it can look like an empty valley. Maybe a stray tool on the surface, carried and dropped by chance. We stand there and think, nobody lived here for a long time. But maybe they did over and over. The record is simply shredded and rearranged. On hillsides and slopes, the same kind of slow violence happens, just with less water and more gravity. Every rainstorm loosens grains of soil. Tree roots pry apart rock. Animals burrow. Freeze-thaw cycles wedge open tiny cracks. Over time, soil creeps downhill in a slow, continuous flow. You won't see it happening if you stand there for an afternoon. But over centuries, fence posts tilt, stone walls bulge, and buried objects migrate downward and downslope. Archaeologists call this slope processes or mass wasting. It includes dramatic landslides and rock falls, but also the almost invisible creep that's happening all the time. Imagine a small camp on a gentle slope. People drop tools, break bones, bury a dog, leave a hearth. Then, for 1,000 years, the hillside goes about its business. Soil thickens upslope as vegetation traps sediment. Downslope, deposits thin as rain and gravity carry particles away. Those artifacts are no longer where they started. A hearth that was once level might tilt and smear. A burial might be stretched and disturbed. Stone flakes might be scattered downslope by a metre, 5 metres, 20, mixed with material from later visits or from entirely different eras. In some places, repeated small landslides can peel away the top, exposing ancient layers and making them easy to find. In others, the opposite happens. Each slide piles more material on top, burying whole landscapes under tongues of debris. What looks like a natural hillside can be sitting on top of stacked, stepped remnants of past occupations, each one a little farther back and higher up the slope than the last. Wind gets in on the act too, especially in cold or dry regions stripped of vegetation. Fine, glacially ground dust can blow for hundreds of kilometres, settling out as a blanket called loess. Layer upon layer, it builds thick, soft, yellowish deposits that can be tens of metres deep. In China, in parts of Europe, in the American Midwest, whole human worlds once unfolded on these loess plains. Then the wind laid more down on top. To an archaeologist, loess is a gift and a curse. It's easy to dig. It can preserve fragile remains beautifully, keeping bones and hearths intact. But it's also a superb hider. A campfire from 25,000 years ago might now lie 10 metres down, under farm fields that have been ploughed for centuries. Without deep coring or a road cutting through a slope at just the right angle, we would never know it was there. In deserts and coastal margins, sand dunes do something similar but more dramatically. Dunes crawl. They inch forward under the push of prevailing winds, swallowing shrubs, rocks, even whole oases. A camp on the edge of a dune field might be half buried in a single storm. Over years, the entire settlement can vanish under shifting hills of sand, preserved in astonishing detail beneath an apparently empty landscape. There are places where later dunes shifted again, exposing stone floors and house outlines that had been entombed for thousands of years. Those are lucky. In many more cases, the sand kept going in one direction, piling higher and higher. The buried layers are still there, but now they are metres, even tens of metres, below the surface. Each additional metre means exponentially more effort, time and money to find them. All of this adds up to a simple, inconvenient truth. Many of the places people lived the longest and most intensively are precisely the places where sediment tends either to strip the record away or bury it beyond easy reach. Floodplains are fertile and attractive. They are also unstable and prone to rearrangement. Coastal lowlands offer rich resources, but are constantly reworked by waves and storms, and later by rising seas. Gentle hills with good drainage draw settlements over and over, but soil creep and landslides gnaw at them relentlessly. Wind-exposed plains are easy to travel and hunt on, but loess and dunes can smother their stories under deep blankets. From our high, late vantage point, when we map known sites on a region, we often see patterns, clusters in some areas, almost nothing in others. It's tempting to turn those blank patches into narratives. Maybe no one lived here, maybe culture retreated to safer ground. Maybe there was a collapse. Sometimes that's true. But often those silences are as much geological as historical. A so-called gap in the record can mean many things. People moved away. People stayed but used materials and practices that left little trace, or the traces are still there, but hidden under metres of river mud, slope debris or wind-blown dust. Our picture of the past is not only filtered by what people made, but by where they made it and by what the landscape did afterward. When we listen to the great silence, then we are listening through the rumble of moving ground. Under the next quiet valley, under the next flat field, under the dunes and the lowest hills, there may be entire chapters of human life folded neatly into the earth, not erased, but filed away in places we haven't yet learned how, or decided it's worth the cost to look. And even where we could, Some of those chapters have literally gone downstream. Rivers don't only bury, they also drown and carry away. Which raises another problem for our story of absence. What happens when not just a river, but an entire shoreline moves? When coasts redraw themselves and low country drowns? To follow the next part of the Great Silence, we have to leave the land and go underwater into the drowned homelands that once lay dry beneath Ice Age skies. When the last great ice sheets were at their peak, the world's shorelines were not where they are now. So much water was locked up in continental ice that global sea level stood more than 100 meters lower than today. Drop the oceans by that much and the map of the planet changes. Broad, flat coastal plains appear around every continent. River valleys run much farther out, carving deep channels into what is now continental shelf. Islands fuse into larger land masses. Narrow straits widen into walkable corridors. Places we now think of as separate, Britain and France, Siberia and Alaska, mainland Asia and the Indonesian islands, were linked by dry ground. Those lowlands were not marginal, forgotten edges. For Ice Age people, they were prime real estate. Follow a river downstream today and notice where the farms cluster, where the towns and ports sit, where highways converge. Now imagine the sea pulled back another 100 kilometres, the river flowing on across a broad, marshy plain before finally reaching the ancient shore. That is where many people would have been. Coasts offered almost everything a hunter-gatherer group could want. Mild, buffered climates compared to the interior, fewer temperature extremes, abundant fresh water in marshes, springs and river mouths, rich food webs stacked on top of each other, fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, edible seaweeds, estuarine plants, plus the usual land animals attracted to the same water and vegetation. On land, resources can be patchy and seasonal. Along a productive coast, the calendar of opportunity gets crowded. Different shellfish peak at different times. Migratory birds arrive and depart. Fish runs pulse up the rivers. Seals haul out on certain beaches. If one source fails, another may still be available. For mobile people with good local knowledge, this means security. And then there's movement. Water is a natural highway. Even before sophisticated boats, rivers and coastal shallows made travel easier. You can walk along a firm tidal flat far faster than through tangled forest or broken hills. Once you add rafts, dugouts and simple paddles, the advantages multiply. Heavy loads become manageable, distances shrink, trade, marriage and story networks can stretch hundreds of kilometres along a shoreline with far less effort than the same distance over land. So when you think of where people were 30,000 or 20,000 years ago, it's helpful to tip the map in your mind. Yes, there were inland camps, upland hunting grounds, valley floor winter shelters. But draped along those now vanished coasts, especially near river mouths and in broad, low-lying plains, there were likely strings of seasonal camps, semi-permanent villages, maybe even long-lived regional hubs, places families returned to year after year, generation after generation. Then the ice melted. Not all at once, not everywhere at the same time. The great ice sheets retreated in pulses, responding to shifts in global temperature, ocean currents, and feedback loops. But over roughly the last 20,000 years, from the end of the last glacial maximum to the early Holocene, sea level rose and kept rising. Sometimes it crept upward by a few millimetres a year, a change no one person would notice. Sometimes, during meltwater pulses, when huge ice reservoirs collapsed, it surged much faster, metres in a few centuries. Fast enough that grandparents might point to a distant sandbar and tell their grandchildren, "We used to camp there." Now it's gone. Every metre of sea level rise pushes the shoreline inland over flat terrain by tens, sometimes hundreds, of metres. Multiply that by more than 100 metres of total rise, and you can see what happened. Those Ice Age coastal plains? Drowned. Many ancient river mouths, estuaries and lagoons, now tens of kilometres offshore, under tens of metres of water. And with them went the physical traces of the people who had lived there. Archaeologists sometimes talk about the continental shelves as drowned landscapes or submerged prehistory. That language hints at what's really going on. These are not empty seabeds. They are former forests, grasslands, wetlands, dunes, rivers. They are old travel routes and hunting grounds. They are quite likely some of the most densely used human territories of the late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age world. But for the most part, they are invisible to us. Think about how we normally discover ancient sites on land. A farmer ploughs up a scatter of stone tools. A road cuts slices through a hill and reveals a dark band of charcoal and bone. A housing development scrapes away the topsoil and exposes post holes and floors. Even careful scientific surveys, grids walked on foot, test pits dug by hand, depend on some kind of surface access, some hint at or near ground level that there's something worth investigating below. Underwater, none of those casual, cheap discovery methods work. You can't stroll across the continental shelf and notice a few flakes of flint. The surface is the sea surface. Everything else is concealed by water, often by layers of mud and shifting sand as well. To even begin looking, you need boats, sonar, divers, or remotely operated vehicles. You need time, expertise, and money. Surveying even a few square kilometres in detail becomes a multi-year project involving teams and infrastructure. The price of admission is high, and that alone explains a big part of the silence. There are technical challenges too. Visibility underwater is often poor. Light fades quickly with depth and turbidity. Fine silt, stirred up by waves, trawling, or the very presence of divers, can turn a promising site into a brown fog within minutes. Strong currents limit how long and where you can work. Cold temperatures and pressure add physical limits. Equipment fails, weather closes in, and preservation underwater is complicated. Water can destroy, but under the right conditions, it can also protect. On an exposed seabed swept by waves and storms, artifacts can be scattered, abraded or buried and re-exposed many times. Organic material, wood, bone, textiles can be quickly eaten away by boring organisms, fungi and bacteria, especially in warm, oxygen-rich shallows. A camp that sat in a calm estuary 15,000 years ago might now lie on an open, energetic shelf edge, its remains smeared thin by centuries of storm-driven sand. But where fine sediments settle and stay put, a different story unfolds. In quiet basins, old river channels, or sheltered lagoons that later drowned, layers of mud can build up rapidly, smothering whatever lies beneath. If those sediments become anoxic, deprived of oxygen, decay slows dramatically. The tiny creatures that normally chew their way through wood and bone simply can't function. In such places, things survive that would normally vanish. Stone tools and hearths, of course, they are almost indestructible. But also wooden stakes and posts from fish traps or simple docks, still standing upright in the buried channel floor. Planks from walkways or platforms, woven fish weirs made from branches and twigs, their general form still visible, in waterlogged tangles. Occasionally, even carved wood or worked bone, preserved with a softness that makes it hard to believe they are thousands of years old. There are sites like this in the North Sea, in the Mediterranean, off the coasts of Florida and Australia, small windows into a much larger, still concealed world. In the North Sea, a lost landscape archaeologists call Doggerland once connected Britain to mainland Europe, a low, rolling plain with rivers, lakes and marshes. Trawlers sometimes pull up fragments of peat, pieces of antler tools, even human bones from its buried surface. Off the coast of Israel, submerged Neolithic villages lie under a few meters of water, with stone house outlines and wells still traceable on the seafloor. Near Denmark, Mesolithic fish weirs built of stakes and brush have been found in now drowned inlets, preserved in the soft mud. These are tantalizing glimpses, not a full map. For every underwater site we know, there are almost certainly thousands we don't, simply because we haven't looked in the right place with the right tools. Our sonar coverage is patchy. High-resolution seabed mapping is expensive and often focused on commercial priorities: shipping lanes, pipelines, offshore wind farms. Even when anomalies are spotted, odd ridges, possible paleocanals, clusters of stones, there may be no funding or time to send divers or robots down to check. So our picture of early coastal life is skewed in two ways. First, it's biased toward the few stretches of ancient shoreline that happen, by geological accident, to still be on land. Uplifted coasts where tectonic forces have raised old beaches above current sea level, or former estuaries that were protected from drowning by local conditions. Second, it's biased toward underwater locations that are easy to work in, shallow, sheltered, close to shore, in regions where research budgets and interest happen to exist. We look at this narrow sample and are tempted, again, to turn silence into story. Maybe people didn't use the coasts much. Maybe marine resources were marginal. Maybe intensive coastal life only developed very late. But the drowned plains argue otherwise. Global population models suggest that, at various points in the late Ice Age and early Holocene, a significant fraction of all humans alive may have been living in those now submerged coastal zones. If that's even roughly true, then a large part of our species' daily life, our diets, our travel, our rituals and innovations, played out on land we can't easily reach. The continental shelves, then, are not a footnote. They are missing chapters. Chapters where small boats were perfected and navigation traditions took shape, where nets, traps, and complex coastal ecologies were first mastered, where songs followed the lines of the tides as much as the paths of rivers, where decisions about staying, moving, or adapting to rising water had to be made again and again. Some of those stories are preserved, folded into drowned valleys and buried under anoxic mud. Many more have been broken apart and rearranged by waves, currents, and time, their pieces scattered beyond recognition, until we learn to read the seafloor with the same ease and coverage that we now read the land. Our map of early human life will have a jagged edge right at the coast, a hard cut where the evidence simply falls off into blue. And that edge matters, because the time when seas rose, coasts drowned, and people had to adapt or retreat overlaps with another kind of transformation. As some lowlands disappeared underwater, other landscapes inland and upland were changing too, becoming warmer, more stable, more predictable. In some of those places, people began to do something new, stay put on purpose, and coax food from the ground. To understand why that sudden increase in archaeological noise appears after so many quiet millennia, we have to look not just at where people were, but at how they were living, and how those new ways of life leave different kinds of traces in the earth. So far we've been talking about space, where people lived, which landscapes preserved them, which ones erased them. Coastlines that moved, plains that drowned, valleys that were scraped clean by ice and rivers. But there's another dimension that creates silence in the record: time. When archaeologists say there's nothing here for 1,000 years, they don't mean they dug up a calendar that says closed until further notice. They mean that when they line up the dates from a region, certain centuries look strangely empty. Sometimes that emptiness is real, people moved away, or numbers fell so low that barely anything was built, lost, or buried. But often, the emptiness is an illusion built out of physics, chemistry, and the difficulty of turning a charred twig or a shell fragment into a number on a page. To see how this illusion happens, it helps to start with the most famous archaeological clock we have, radiocarbon. Every living thing on Earth is quietly ticking along with a bit of radioactive carbon in its body. Cosmic rays hit the upper atmosphere and create a rare form of carbon called carbon-14. It mixes with regular carbon, gets taken up by plants, then eaten by animals, then by us. As long as you're alive, you keep exchanging carbon with your surroundings. The ratio of carbon-14 to normal carbon in your body stays roughly in step with the atmosphere. The moment you die, the exchange stops. From that instant on, the carbon-14 in your tissues begins to decay at a predictable rate. Half of it disappears in about 5,730 years, another half again in the next 5,730. After enough time, there's so little left that it's hard to measure at all. Radiocarbon dating works by taking a tiny sample of something that was once alive. A seed, a piece of wood, a scrap of cloth, a bone, and counting how much carbon-14 is left. Compare that to what you'd expect in the modern atmosphere, and you get an age. But that age isn't a perfect timestamp. It's a range, with a blur of uncertainty around it. For young samples, say from 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, the blur is fairly narrow. We might be able to say this charcoal probably burned sometime between 2,200 and 2,300 years ago. As you go further back, the blur spreads. Tiny measurement errors start to matter more. At 10,000 or 20,000 years, a small difference in the count can shift your estimate by centuries. At 30,000 or 40,000 years, the signal is so faint that background noise, contamination from groundwater, tiny modern carbon particles, even traces left behind by laboratory handling can push the apparent age older or younger than it really is. So older periods naturally look fuzzier. Individual dated events spread out into broad probability clouds. When you try to reconstruct a timeline from those clouds, you don't get a crisp film. You get a smeared painting, and then there's the atmosphere itself. Radiocarbon dating assumes that the amount of carbon-14 in the air has been constant through time. It hasn't. The sun's activity, Earth's magnetic field, ocean circulation, even human burning of fossil fuels, all of these change how much carbon-14 is produced and how it cycles through the system. To correct for this, scientists build what are called calibration curves. They take things where the calendar age is independently known, tree rings, corals, varves in lake sediments, and measure their radiocarbon content. By lining up those known ages with their carbon-14 levels, they create a wiggly curve that translates radiocarbon years into real years. Most of the time that works well, but sometimes the curve goes flat, or doubles back on itself in little plateaus. That means that for certain periods, very different calendar years can share almost the same radiocarbon signature. A piece of charcoal from 31,000 years ago and one from 32,000 might look almost identical to the machine. When you calibrate their ages, you don't get a neat single peak. You get a broad, flattened range, sometime in this 500-year span, or maybe that one. On a plot of dates, those plateaus show up as strange gaps and clusters. Fewer dates fall exactly in the plateau's middle, not because people vanished, but because the mathematics smears their events to the plateau's edges. Centuries that were full of lives and camps and fires can look statistically empty. Other quirks creep in too. Sometimes the sample you date is older than the human activity you care about. This is the old wood effect. Imagine a group in the Ice Age cutting down a dead tree that had been standing, slowly decaying, for hundreds of years. They burn it in their hearth. You excavate the site long afterward and date a chunk of that charcoal. The number you get is the age of the tree's last growth ring, not the moment the people cooked their meal. If they used driftwood washed in from who knows where, or peat cut from ancient bog deposits, the mismatch can be thousands of years. Your apparently very old campsite might actually be much younger, its date pulled backward in time by long-dead fuel. On the other side, Contamination can make things seem younger. Tiny roots worming through soil can add modern carbon. Groundwater carrying dissolved carbon can slip into pores in bone or shell. Even the consolidants and glues that conservators once used to strengthen fragile objects can quietly reset the radiocarbon clock. A mammoth bone from 30,000 years ago that spent a few thousand years soaking in carbonate-rich water might test as 20,000. An old hearth partially disturbed and mixed with later plant roots can drift forward on paper by millennia. Multiply these issues across hundreds of sites, and you begin to see how time itself starts to stutter. Clusters of dates huddle in certain periods, where the calibration curve is kind and preservation was good. Other spans thin out, not necessarily because people weren't there, but because our clocks lose resolution, or because the materials we most rely on simply didn't survive. And radiocarbon is only one story. Archaeologists and geologists use other clocks too, each with its own strengths and blind spots. Luminescence dating, often used on sediments, and some heated objects measures trapped electrons in mineral crystals. Quartz and feldspar grains act like tiny sand timers. Radiation from the environment slowly fills them up with energy. Sunlight or high heat empties them again. Bury a grain in darkness, and its luminescence charge starts to build. Expose it to light during excavation, and the clock resets. By measuring how full the grain is and knowing the local radiation rate, scientists can estimate when it was last exposed to the sun or to fire. That tells you when a sand layer was laid down or when a brick last baked in a kiln. It's one way to date sites that lack bone or charcoal, but it comes with broad age ranges, and it's easy to accidentally reset during sampling. U-series dating looks at how uranium decays into thorium and other elements in things like cave stalagmites, corals, and some shells. It's invaluable for deep prehistory, stretching beyond the reach of radiocarbon. A thin crust of calcite over rock art can give you a minimum age. The painting must be older than the crust that coats it. A dated coral terrace can tell you when sea level last stood at that height. But these methods usually date the growth of stone and shell, not the exact human act we care about. They frame human events in broader environmental time. Then there's dendrochronology, tree ring dating. In some regions, especially in the Holocene, we can line up annual rings from living trees, old buildings, archaeological timbers, and preserved forest logs into unbroken sequences stretching back thousands of years. Each ring is a year, patterns of thick and thin rings reflecting wet and dry seasons match across trees like barcodes. Attach a beam from an ancient house to that master sequence, and you can sometimes say this tree was felled in the summer of 3267 BCE. It's the closest thing we have to a precise calendar in the deep past. But it only works where trees grow in the right way, where wood survives, and where enough samples exist to build and cross-check those long reference chains. Now imagine all these clocks layered on top of a single place. A cave might have Neanderthal hearths near the bottom, radiocarbon dated with big error bars. Above them, a stalagmite dated by U-series tells you that drip water flowed steadily through the last glacial. Higher still, a thin layer of ash whose minerals have been dated with luminescence. Then, near the top, a Bronze Age beam whose outermost tree ring ties into a dendrochronological sequence with year-by-year precision. When you draw that history on a chart, it looks like a smooth line of occupation. But inside the layers, time behaves strangely. Caves, rock shelters, favoured hilltops, riverside terraces, they get reused. Generations return to the same good spots over and over, separated by decades, centuries, sometimes thousands of years. Each visit leaves traces, a hearth, a few tools, some bones. Over time, these discrete moments blur into one archaeological layer. What looks like a single busy stratum might actually be the compressed residue of 5 or 50 separate episodes. If you only have a handful of dates, it's easy to think, people settled here around 18,000 years ago, used it intensively for a few centuries, then vanished. The reality might be more like brief visits at 19,200, 18,800, 18,300, 17,900, and 17,400 each, too thin to form its own layer, all mashed together by trampling, burrowing animals and slow sediment. Trickle. Other gaps arise, not because layers are missing, but because datable material is. Stone tools don't contain carbon. Most sediments don't either. If a group favoured clean-burning fuel that left little charcoal, if bones were scavenged away by animals, if the only organic remains were soft plants that rotted completely, then an entire phase of activity might be archaeologically visible but chronologically mute. You find the flaws, you find the tools, you know people were there. But without something you can hook to a clock, their years hang in a grey, undated fog. As methods improve, some of that fog thins. New calibration curves, updated with more tree rings and corals, can reshape radiocarbon chronologies, pulling apparent gaps closed and separating false clusters. Better pretreatment chemistries strip away contaminants from bone and charcoal, pushing their ages back to where they belong. High-precision AMS machines can measure smaller samples and distinguish subtle differences that old counters blurred. Luminescence techniques get refined, reducing uncertainties. U-series measurements become more accurate as we understand how uranium moves through calcite. Bayesian statistical models let archaeologists combine multiple lines of evidence, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, artifact styles, into coherent timelines that respect both the numbers and the dirt. Sometimes, without a single new site being found, a region's history doubles in resolution. Periods that once looked empty fill in with redated events. An apparent hiatus between 28,000 and 26,000 years ago turns out to be an artifact of calibration plateaus and coarse sampling. The same cave that once seemed abandoned for a millennium now shows thin but continuous use. The past didn't change. Our clocks did. This is one of the quiet lessons hidden in the great archaeological silence. When we peer back tens of thousands of years and see long stretches with few dates, few sites, little apparent activity, we're looking not just at the behaviour of ancient people, but at the limitations of our tools. Our picture of early human life is built out of fragments filtered through decaying atoms, imperfect curves, reused shelters, drowned shores, and missing charcoal. And yet, even through that haze, we can glimpse something profound. Before cities and writing and thick layers of trash, there were still memories. There were still lineages, alliances, obligations. People knew who they were and where they came from. They remembered floods and fires and long winters. Most of that memory never touched stone or bone at all. It lived in voices, in stories, in songs passed along night after night in the dark, histories that slipped past our dating methods entirely, leaving almost no trace except the faintest echoes in later traditions. To follow those echoes, we have to turn from clocks and layers to something even more intangible than time, the ways humans remember when the earth itself refuses to write anything down. When people talk about the beginning of history, they almost always mean the beginning of writing. Cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, oracle bones in China, marks on durable surfaces that we can still hold, read, and argue about. Writing feels like a bright line. On one side, myth and legend. On the other, dates and names and events you can cross-check. And in a way, it is a line. But not because writing suddenly created memory. It changed what kind of memory could be audited. Once someone scratches a list of grain deliveries into wet clay and leaves it to bake in the sun, you can do something new. You can compare that list to another list. You can see that the scribe in year 10 of King so-and-so recorded more barley from village A than the scribe in year 9. You can notice that a certain official's name appears, then disappears. You can follow a tax rate over time, a word's spelling, a king's boast copied and recopied across centuries. Writing doesn't make the past more real. It simply creates fixed points that later minds can test against each other. In a written culture, a contradiction can surface because two documents disagree. In an oral culture, a contradiction is more likely to be smoothed out in the telling. That difference, more than anything, is why the last few thousand years feel noisy and detailed, while the 30,000 years you're lying here thinking about feel like a hush. But no writing doesn't mean no history. For most of our species' existence, history lived in air and memory. The archives were people, elders, ritual specialists, storytellers, parents by the fire telling children about winters they themselves had never seen, but their grandparents had. Oral traditions have rules just as strict as any archive. They're just not written down. In many small-scale societies, certain stories are owned by particular lineages or inherited offices. You don't get to change them freely. Verses are repeated, corrected, polished. Apprentices spend years memorizing long genealogies, epics, laws. If they deviate too far, they're told so. In some traditions, retelling a myth wrongly isn't just a slip. It's dangerous, sacrilegious. Because of this, oral histories can be astonishingly stable in outline. They carry names, place associations, sequences of events across vast stretches of time. They encode knowledge of plants, animals, taboos, routes and boundaries that matter for survival. But they obey different evidentiary rules than a clay tablet. A story is always performed in the present, for a particular audience, in a particular mood. Tiny adjustments creep in, a metaphor updated, a character's emotion expanded, a lesson sharpened. Over many centuries, those small shifts accumulate. The backbone of the tale can remain, but the flesh that covers it changes colour and tone. For historians, that creates a paradox. Oral traditions can be deeply informative, but they resist the kind of pinpoint dating that archaeological layers or written chronicles allow. You might hear a coastal community recount a flood that drowned ancestral lands, a long-remembered line of "when our grandfathers lived up where the sea now is." You might suspect from geology that they're remembering a post-Ice Age sea level rise or a great tsunami. But it's difficult to say, was that 7,000 years ago? 4,000? 1,000? The story often won't tell you in numbers. It will tell you in relationships. This happened when that mountain still had snow, before that hero was born, after the time of such and such ancestor. That's a perfectly functional temporal framework inside the culture. It just doesn't snap neatly onto our calibrated calendars. Still, myths and songs have a way of catching echoes of real events. In Australia, some Aboriginal groups preserve stories of coasts where none now exist, islands that were once connected by dry land. In Polynesia, voyaging traditions remember chains of islands in a particular order, matching what we know about migration routes from archaeology and genetics. In parts of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, tales of cities under the waves, and land that the sea ate may reflect memories of slow inundation or catastrophic storms. In Northern Europe and North America, stories of the year with no summer, skies dimmed, harvests failing, sound a great deal like oral memories of volcanic eruptions or sudden climate swings. Among Arctic peoples, narratives of shifting ice, strange animals, and changing winds could be responses to real environmental changes compressed and symbolized across generations. But could be is the key phrase. The same story can be read many ways. Is a dragon a memory of an Ice Age predator, or a metaphor for floods, or a symbol for invaders, or all of those at once? Does a tale of a trickster stealing fire recall a technological innovation, or is it simply an explanation of why humans alone use flames? The temptation to map every striking myth directly onto a geological or climatic event is strong, especially when you're staring into the long silence of prehistory. But the mapping is rarely one-to-one. Respectful uncertainty is the only honest stance. A story might preserve a kernel of ancient experience. It might also have been reshaped by later politics, new environments, or religious change. Often, multiple interpretations can sit side by side, none provably correct, each illuminating a different facet of human response to the world. Something similar happens with early symbols and art. When you see marks on bone or stone from tens of thousands of years ago, engraved lines, repeated patterns, dots, chevrons, it's tempting to think, early writing. A code we just haven't cracked. In caves, sequences of signs appear again and again, certain shapes near certain animals, specific clusters repeated across regions. On portable objects, notches and tally-like cuts run along the edge. Some researchers argue these are proto-notations, lunar calendars, hunting records, counts of kills or seasons. Perhaps they are. They certainly show abstraction, repetition, and intent. But they are not writing in the sense that cuneiform or hieroglyphs are writing. Writing, as historians usually define it, ties specific visual signs to the sounds or words of a spoken language in a consistent way. It lets you reconstruct speech, at least approximately, across time and space. A Sumerian tablet isn't just a picture of a transaction. It's the transaction, sentence by sentence, frozen. You can translate it. You can argue about what a term means. You can compare it line by line to another tablet and see which scribe made a copying error. The symbols painted in a cave or scratched on a piece of antler might instead be flexible cues, reminders to those already initiated, prompts for stories, markers of identity, territorial signs, ritual devices. They can be rich with meaning, but they don't yet lock that meaning to specific spoken phrases in a way we can reverse engineer. So we're left in an in-between zone. Art and marks tell us that people were thinking symbolically, organizing experience, probably telling complex stories to each other. Oral traditions in later societies tell us that those stories could, in principle, carry memories of real places, real migrations, real disasters across many generations. But without writing, the bridge between past event and present reconstruction is made of inference, analogy, and probabilities. You can walk out onto it carefully. You can say, this myth might recall that shoreline. This cluster of flood stories could hint at that meltwater pulse. This motif of stars moving in the sky might reflect knowledge of precession or comet passages. But you can't slam your foot down and declare certainty without breaking the bridge. In the space before writing, then, we move through a landscape of layered possibilities. Archaeology gives us camps, tools, bones. Climatology gives us curves of ice and pollen. Genetics gives us branching trees of ancestry. Oral tradition, myth, early symbols and songs give us patterns of meaning that may, and sometimes probably do, overlap with those other lines of evidence. Where they intersect, where a story about a vanished river matches up with buried channels in the ground, or a legend of people arriving from a particular direction fits genetic and linguistic flows, we glimpse something like a face through frosted glass. The details are blurred, but the outline feels human, coherent. Where they don't intersect, or where they contradict, we're reminded to be cautious. Silence in one record doesn't always mean absence in another. A myth with no obvious geological anchor may still tell us volumes about social values, fears, aspirations. A pattern of dots with no decipherable code may still mark the birth of systematic thought. As we drift deeper into the great quiet before cities and scripts, it helps to hold both thoughts at once. That pre-literate humans had histories as rich and tangled as ours, full of remembered places, ancestors and events, and that most of those histories will never be pinned to exact years or fully translated into our categories. The earth has erased their dates and most of their objects. The air has let go of their voices. What's left are faint crossings, stories, symbols, songs that we can approach, compare and listen to, but never fully command. Beyond those, the main traces that grow more frequent are the ones that happen to stick best. Paint in cool caves, carved lines in deep rock, pockets of expression that the environment accidentally protected while almost everything else dissolved. To follow them, we step into the rare places where the great silence grows thin, and the walls themselves remember. Step into a cave, and the first thing you notice isn't usually the art. It's the air, cool, steady, a little damp. The temperature doesn't swing wildly between day and night, summer and winter. The light fades quickly as you move inward, until only a dim greyness remains. The wind is mostly shut out. Rain, frost, sun, all the things that strip away paint and polish stone on the open hillsides, can't reach you here. That's the main reason caves show up so loudly in the archaeological record. They are not mystical vaults specially chosen by the past to speak to us. They're places where the normal processes that erase human presence are slowed to a crawl. A pigment brushed onto a rock face under an open sky has to survive wetting and drying, heating and cooling, moss, lichen, sand in the wind. Even a deeply carved engraving exposed on a cliff is gradually rounded and blurred by frost and rain. Give it 10,000 years, 2030, and the lines that once were sharp become soft, then faint, then gone. Inside a stable cave, the clock runs differently. The walls don't bake in the sun. They're not drenched in every storm. There are fewer plants trying to colonize the surface, fewer crystals bursting in and out of existence as water freezes and thaws. A layer of mineral-rich dripstone might even grow over a painting and seal it like a time capsule. From our point of view, that makes caves feel like special museums of Ice Age minds. But it's important to remember they're special mainly because they're sheltered. Most of the marks humans ever made were not in caves. Think about where you'd actually spend time if you were a forager following rivers, herds, and seasonal plants. You'd be in open rock shelters with a good view of the valley, on boulders near water, on trees, on the flattened ground of campfires and workspaces. You might daub paint on a skin tent, carve designs into a wooden post, weave a pattern into a basket, etch a symbol into a cliff face that caught the last light of the evening sun. Almost all of that is gone. The art that survives, especially from the deep past, is often the art that happened to be put in the few places that Mother Nature decided to babysit for us. So when we look at famous painted caves in France or Spain, or engraved shelters in Australia or Southern Africa, we have to keep a quiet caution in mind. This is not a neutral sample. This is what the environment allowed to remain. Even so, what does remain is extraordinary. In some caves, whole walls are covered with horses, bison, aurochs, mammoths, lions, rhinos, deer, animals that were hunted, feared, revered, or simply watched closely enough to capture the curve of a muscle, the angle of a horn. Hands appear too, sprayed silhouettes, fingers missing, palms reaching out of the dark toward us. Abstract signs cluster around them, dots, lines, ladders, zigzags, branching shapes. From this we can say certain things with some confidence. We know that these people looked intensely at the animals around them. The details are too precise for casual sketching. They watched how a herd moved, how a wounded bison tilted its head, how a horse's mane fell when it ran. This wasn't just drawing what you see in a lazy way. It was learned technique passed on and practiced. We know they had some sense of repetition and convention. The same kinds of signs appear next to certain animals in different caves, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart. Certain poses recur, certain ways of showing movement repeat. That suggests shared habits of representation, maybe shared stories or ritual frameworks. We know they thought about identity and presence. Hand stencils can be read in many ways: signatures, participation marks in a ceremony, records of "we were here." Their distribution, sometimes in clusters, sometimes alone, hints at social roles. Maybe some hands mark particular individuals, statuses, or achievements. We suspect, based on context, that some of this art had ritual importance. Many images cluster in parts of caves that are hard to reach, deep inside where no casual visitor would wander. Some animals appear disproportionately often, not in line with their bones in the local food remains. That imbalance whispers of symbolic weight, animals of power, danger, taboo, or myth. But even here, in this richest surviving record, a lot of what we'd like to know refuses to sit still. Were those bison stories of creation, teaching tools for young hunters, tokens in seasonal ceremonies about migration and return, maps of territory with animals as stand-ins for places and routes? Different caves might have served different functions. Even within one cave, meanings may have shifted over centuries. The pigments and scratches themselves don't tell us, and dating them is harder than it might seem if you're lucky. Some of the paint is made with charcoal. Charcoal contains carbon. Carbon can be radiocarbon dated. You take a minuscule sample, run it through the lab, and get an age with a nice uncertainty range. But many pigments are made from minerals like ochre iron oxides, which don't carry the same datable carbon signature. You can date a thin film of carbonate that formed over the painting, or under it, using other methods, and that gives you a before or after bracket. Still, the exact year, often even the exact millennium, remains fuzzy. Engravings are even trickier. A line cut into stone doesn't contain anything alive. You can sometimes date the growth of mineral crust in the groove, or use indirect arguments. If an engraving is under a layer of sediment that we can date, it's older than that. If it cuts through another mark we can roughly date, it's younger. But this is more like bounding a shadow than measuring an object. Because of those limits, archaeologists have turned to style as a kind of clock. You line up caves and shelters, compare how horses are drawn here versus there, how often certain signs appear together, how deep the colour palette runs, how figures overlap. You look at superimpositions. This kind of animal is painted over that kind of sign, so it's probably later. Gradually a sequence emerges: early motifs, middle phases, late developments, regional schools of art, fashions in symbolism. It's careful work, often persuasive, but it isn't the same as having a carved date on the wall. Style sequences are hypotheses. They can be strengthened when a radiocarbon date falls where the stylistic model predicted. They can be shaken when it doesn't. They help us tell stories about change, how certain symbols spread, how techniques evolved, but they rest on probabilities, not on a fully fixed timeline. And again, they're built on what survived in a handful of protected spaces. Imagine all the open-air art that went with these cave traditions: painted rock faces at valley entrances, decorated shelters along migration routes, carved posts in temporary camps, body painting and tattoos refreshed at each gathering. The cave art may be the spectacular tip of a very large iceberg of symbolic practice, most of which has melted away. In that sense, rock art is a strange kind of noise in the great silence. On the scale of everyday life, almost everything was quiet. Food scraps, skin clothing, wooden tools, laughter, arguments, songs, most of it leaving no trace we can see now. But in a few places, people concentrated meaning into pigment and line on stone surfaces that happened, by geological accident, to be long-lived. Those surfaces shout across tens of thousands of years. They tell us that symbolic thought, shared stories, and socially charged images were already part of human life long before villages, long before writing. They show us that people invested enormous time and skill into making marks that others would see in dim light and remember. Yet their very loudness can mislead. It's tempting to let the art stand for the whole culture, to imagine Ice Age life as a series of torchlit rituals in echoing halls. In reality, those moments were likely rare, bracketed by long stretches of hunting, gathering, gossip, child-rearing, tool repair, sickness, boredom, joy, most of which left only the faintest material shadow. As we move forward in time, something changes. The number of places where expression survives begins to increase, not just because people are making more things, but because some of those things finally start to line up with environments that preserve them better. Fields, hearths, post holes, graves, rubbish pits, the quiet traces of settled life. The Great Silence doesn't end all at once. It thins in patches. After the caves, the next thinning comes when some groups stop walking quite so far, quite so often, and their histories start to sink roots into the ground. When people start staying put for longer, the earth begins to remember them differently. A mobile camp is light on the land. A few hearths, some scattered bones, footprints that wash away. You return a season later, set up a few meters to the left, and start over. Over generations the traces overlap, blur, and finally get sliced apart by erosion roots, burrowing animals. But once families begin returning to the same spot year after year, or even living there through the seasons, something new appears in the record: accumulation. Hearthstones don't get scattered as far. Broken tools are tossed into the same convenient hollow. Food scraps pile up near where people habitually sit. Ash is dumped in a preferred corner. The ground begins to rise, imperceptibly, as dust, debris, and discarded things build layer on layer. Archaeologists call some of these accumulations middens, rubbish heaps, but they're far from trivial. A midden is an accidental archive of daily life. Broken bones, charred seeds, shattered ceramics, dulled blades, beads that slipped from a necklace. Things that no one meant to preserve, but which, by sheer mass of repetition, sink into the soil and stay. Sedentism, staying in one place for longer stretches, multiplies these quiet archives. So do buildings and storage. Once you can count on finding yourself in roughly the same place next season, a new set of choices opens up. You can afford to dig a deeper storage pit. You can line it with stones or clay. You can build a more substantial shelter, because you're not just pitching it for a week, you're investing in a structure that might see you, your children, maybe even your grandchildren. Walls, even when they're made of fragile stuff like wattle and daub, leave scars. Posts rot away but leave darker stains in the soil. Trenches dug for drainage or fence lines fill in with slightly different sediment. Clay floors get compacted and cracked, then overlaid by new floors. To the eye on the day they're built, these are just practical features of a home. To the archaeologist with a trowel, thousands of years later, they're the faint but readable outlines of a village. This shift didn't happen everywhere at once, and it didn't look the same in each place. In the Near East, people were experimenting with tending wild stands of wheat and barley, while still living in what looked like hunter-gatherer villages. In China, communities began playing with rice and millet. In the Americas, squash, beans, and maize follow their own slow arcs of domestication. In parts of Africa, sorghum, yams, and later cattle take different paths. In New Guinea, tubers become central. Other regions stay with mobile foraging systems that work very well in their own environments. Rather than a single invention of farming, what we see is a patchwork of local experiments, retreats and reinventions, stretched over thousands of years. From our side of time, one of the clearest ways we can detect these shifts is in the bodies of plants and animals themselves. Domestication leaves fingerprints. Wild grains usually shatter easily, scattering their seeds when ripe. Harvest them too soon and you lose productivity. Too late and the seeds are already gone. When people start deliberately gathering and replanting the seeds that don't fall off so readily because they're easier to harvest and carry, over generations the plants shift. Husks become tougher, seed heads larger, the break points less fragile. Under a microscope, the scars on the seed, where it attaches to the stem, change shape. Those tiny details are one of the signals that a population of plants has moved from wild to domesticated or semi-domesticated. Animal bones tell similar stories. Wild sheep and goats have particular horn curves and body sizes. Dogs diverge from wolves in skull shape and dentition. In some early village sites, the age and sex profiles of animal remains don't look like natural deaths in a wild herd. They look like managed culling, favouring certain ages or keeping females longer for milk or breeding. Over time, some species shrink under domestication, others are selected to grow larger. These trends, played out over centuries, are the skeletal echoes of human choices. Even the chemistry inside bones and teeth can betray a change in lifestyle. Isotopes, variant forms of elements like carbon and nitrogen, enter our bodies through food and water. Different plants use different photosynthetic pathways and carry different carbon isotope ratios. Marine foods, freshwater fish, grazing animals, and grain-based diets all leave distinct signatures. When people shift from a broad spectrum of wild foods to a diet more heavily based on particular crops, the isotope balance in their skeletons adjusts. To a lab technician with a spectrometer, that adjustment is another quiet record of fields being planted and tended. Tools also morph. Grinding stones become more common as seeds and grains are processed into flour. Sickles with silica gloss from cutting cereal stems appear. Hoes, spades, and later plough parts show up in places and densities that suggest regular soil working rather than occasional digging. Again, none of these things shout "first farmer" on their own. But together they build a pattern. Yet even with all this new material being produced, early villages could still almost vanish. Many early houses were built from mud, wood, reeds, and thatch, the same kinds of perishable materials human beings had used for tens of thousands of years. Left alone, a mud brick wall will slump into a low, formless mound. Wooden posts rot, thatch collapses and disappears. A few thousand years of rain, plant growth, and bioturbation, and the village can look like an unremarkable rise in a field. What saves some of these sites for us isn't the durability of their construction, but the density of their disturbance. People dig and redig. They cut into old walls to make new ones. They throw rubble into abandoned rooms and build on top. They terrace slopes for planting. They channel water. They clear forests, and when forests regrow, they grow differently on disturbed soils. From above or from a satellite, these modifications can appear as pale lines in a ploughed field, as crop marks where plants grow higher over buried ditches and shorter over stone foundations. From the ground with a shovel, they appear as subtle changes in soil colour and texture. Farming, in this sense, reshapes landscapes into patterned signals. Fields encourage erosion along furrows. Irrigation leaves salty crusts and altered drainage. Long-term grazing changes which plants dominate a hillside. Pollen grains, trapped in lake sediments or peat bogs, record sudden surges of particular species, plants that thrive in cleared, open ground, or crops that weren't present in that region before. Charcoal layers thicken as people burn forests to make room for cultivation. These are big ecological traces, written not in artifacts, but in changed relationships between soil, water, plants, and animals. From a distance, all this can look like a story of progress. More stuff, more sites, more obvious marks. It's tempting to let the multiplying traces stand in for more important or more advanced lives. We have to be careful with that. A village throws a longer archaeological shadow than a band of nomadic foragers, partly because the village concentrates its activities. More garbage in one spot, more digging in a defined area, more repetitive use of the same footprint. That doesn't mean the villagers thought more deeply, felt more intensely, or lived lives more full of meaning than their ancestors who moved with the seasons. It means simply that their way of living produced more things that happen by luck to survive our filters. The great silence thins here, not because human experience suddenly becomes richer, but because some of that experience begins to align with conditions that let it stay visible. Fired clay that doesn't melt in the rain, discarded bones that stay put, fields that reorder whole hillsides. Beyond the first villages, another threshold waits. When people stack their houses denser, when walls rise in stone and brick, when storage becomes surplus and surplus becomes power, the traces grow thicker again, even as the risk of erasure takes on new forms. The ghost of the city stands on the horizon, already beginning to crumble. A village can blur into the soil. A city, you might think, is too big to lose. Streets, walls, temples, markets, palaces, towers and gates and monuments. Tens of thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder, pouring their labour into stone, brick, timber, tile. How could something like that vanish? The answer is that cities are very good at burying themselves. Imagine a town that lasts not for one lifetime, but for 50. Not for a century, but for 1,000 years. Roofs sag and collapse. Walls crack. Floors wear down. Drainage ditches silt up. Fires break out. Floods pour through. None of this destroys the whole city at once. It just creates one more layer of rubble, one more reason to patch, repair, rebuild. And most of the time people don't move away. They stay right where they are. If your well is good and your river still flows and your trade routes still pass through, the logical thing is to fix what's broken and carry on. So you clean up the burned beams, knock down the unsafe walls, push the debris into low spots, level it out, and build again on top. Do that often enough, and the street surface slowly climbs. Door thresholds are raised. Steps multiply in front of houses that once opened directly onto the road. Ground floors become basements. Basements become sealed vaults. What was once the lived surface of the city sinks under successive generations of paving and fill. Archaeologists call these stacked cities, tells in the Near East, or simply mounds elsewhere. To someone walking across a ploughed field, they can look like ordinary low hills. Inside, they're layer cakes of human time, but those layers are not tidy chapters. They're more like a book that's been revised, overwritten, and selectively erased over and over. When a new wall goes up, its foundations cut through older floors, older hearths, older burials. A temple expanded in 1 century might slice directly across a marketplace from 200 years before. To read the earlier city, you have to peel back, centimetre by centimetre, a history of constant modification. And that's if you're lucky. That's if the city stayed where it was. There's another, quieter process that makes urban life hard to see: recycling. In a world where every block of stone had to be quarried by hand, every brick moulded and fired, every timber cut and hauled, the ruins of older buildings are irresistible stockpiles. An empire falls, a temple is abandoned, a palace roof collapses. From our perspective, it looks like a perfect time capsule. From the perspective of the people still living nearby, it looks like free materials. So stone is robbed out of old walls to make new ones. Sculpted blocks are flipped, so the carved face turns inward, invisible, now serving as the sturdy core of a farmhouse. Marble columns are toppled, cut down into paving slabs or burnt in lime kilns to make mortar. Sun-dried bricks crumble, but even their dust can be re-wet, moulded and reused. Fired bricks are even better. They're scavenged, cleaned and slotted neatly into later structures. Tiles from a bathhouse roof become part of someone's kitchen floor. Decorative reliefs are broken up to gravel a courtyard. Metals are the most thoroughly erased of all. Bronze statues don't simply stand forever until we happen to find them. When a city is looted, when a treasury is seized, when an old cult falls out of favour, metal flows. It flows into melting pots. Bells become weapons, broken tools become nails. Bronze fittings from doors and chariots and furniture are recast as coinage or jewellery. Even iron, which rusts so readily, gets salvaged and reforged as long as it's usable. From this angle, the survival of any elaborate metal object is an accident. It had to be hidden, lost, deliberately buried as an offering, or stranded in a context that made recycling impractical. Everything else is returned to the undifferentiated pool of raw material, ready to be poured into the next generation's needs. Fire, war, and rebuilding add their own strange twists. A city burned in a single catastrophic event can leave an almost theatrical level of detail. Collapsed roofs, smashed pots on floors, food still in storage jars, bodies caught mid-escape. The heat can even bake mud brick harder, fixing it more securely in the archaeological record. But most urban destruction is messier and more protracted. Sieges drag on, neighbourhoods burn piecemeal. Earthquakes topple some buildings and spare others. After each shock, survivors pick through the rubble, salvage what they can, and improvise. A wealthy house is subdivided into smaller tenements. A ruined public hall becomes a warren of workshops. Monumental spaces are infilled with shacks. From a distance of 2,000 years, this process blurs the sharp outlines of earlier city plans. Major streets might endure because they follow practical routes, a ridge line, a valley, a convenient approach to a gate. Big temples and palaces may be rebuilt again and again on the same platforms. The skeleton of the city can remain recognizable while the flesh of everyday life, the stalls, the patios, the back alley shrines, dissolves into countless small disturbances, sliced and overwritten by each new phase. And even those outlines depend on what later people chose to do with the ruins. Sometimes, an abandoned city is left more or less alone, bypassed by new routes or feared as a haunted place. In those cases, sand or silt or jungle can seal it over. Walls slump but stay roughly where they were. Floors, once buried, are never again disturbed. Those are the cities we tend to know best. More often, though, the best real estate refuses to stay empty. Rivers and harbours don't move easily. Fertile plains remain fertile. Strategic hills stay strategic. The same advantages that made a place attractive to one society will make it attractive to the next. So a Bronze Age city might be capped by an Iron Age fortress, which is capped in turn by a classical town, then a medieval castle, then a modern village. Each phase digs into, scavenges from, and compacts the remains of the one before. The oldest levels end up deepest, narrowest, most cut through, hardest to reach without tearing up everything on top. In many living cities today, archaeologists can only glimpse the deepest layers through tiny windows. Rescue excavations in basements, subway tunnels, utility trenches. Entire millennia of urban history may be present underfoot, but only as thin, inaccessible slices. On top of all this, there is a more deliberate kind of erasure, the human desire to possess the past. Looting is as old as monuments themselves. Victorious armies have always carried off statues, columns, inscriptions as trophies. Later, local villagers chip away at carved reliefs to sell as curiosities. Tombs are broken open in search of gold. Sculptures are decapitated for their heads. The bodies are left to crumble. In the early days of archaeology, the difference between scientific excavation and treasure hunting was often blurry. Antiquarians dynamited their way into mounds, tore out the impressive objects, and left the stratigraphy, the subtle layering that tells you what happened when, in ruins, A single looted tomb can erase a unique record of burial practice, diet, disease, craftsmanship, and belief. A heavily looted city can lose its inscriptions, its portable art, its diagnostic pottery, leaving behind only foundations and fills, hard to date, harder to interpret. This is one reason why some empires sound so much louder to us than others. States that love to write on durable things, stone stelae, baked clay tablets, monumental walls, shout across time. Egypt, with its carved hieroglyphic texts and desert climate. Mesopotamian kingdoms whose laws and letters were impressed in clay, then accidentally fired when buildings burned. The Roman Empire, with its mile markers and dedicatory plaques and thousands of stamped bricks. Other societies may have been just as complex, just as literate, but chose different media. Ink on wood, pigment on plaster, bark, leather, papyrus stored in damp conditions. If their inscriptions were never copied onto stone, their voices can be almost entirely gone, even if their cities were just as real, just as populous. So when we look out across the archaeological landscape and see some cultures blaring in surround sound and others barely whispering, that doesn't necessarily reflect how important they were. It reflects what they wrote on, what they built with, how their successors treated their ruins, and how much time and disturbance stands between them and us. At every step, survival has depended on later choices. Did the next generation quarry the temple or wall it off? Did they level the old palace to make vineyards, or let wind-blown sand cover the site? Did they value old inscriptions as sacred, or grind them up to make new mortar? Did they treat ancient cemeteries with reverence, or mine them for treasure? Our map of the urban past is stitched together from the lucky pauses in that ongoing process of reuse. In the great silence of human history, even cities, the densest, noisiest expressions of our species, are fragile. They endure only where collapse was followed for a while by neglect, where value was forgotten long enough for dust to do its quiet work of preservation. To listen for the people who lived in those streets, we often have to turn away from the missing walls and melted statues, and pay attention instead to the tiniest remnants that couldn't be profitably moved or reused, the things nobody bothered to loot, the crumbs of daily life that slipped through the fingers of time. If you zoom in far enough, the silence breaks. When the big things are gone, the walls, the statues, the inscriptions, what's left are traces almost too small to notice. A fragment of bone, a smear of soot, a kernel of charred grain, blackened and half melted into the floor of a hearth. Those are the bits that nobody thought were worth stealing, nobody tried to reuse. And that is exactly why they can still talk. Start with bones. To a bioarchaeologist, a skeleton is not just a death. It's a biography. Look closely at a human femur, and you can see how much strain it carried. Heavy, repetitive labour leaves tiny changes in muscle attachment sites and joint surfaces. Knees and spines show the grind of years spent squatting, lifting, carrying loads. Shoulder joints remember whether most of the work was done with the right arm or the left. Teeth record childhood in even more painful detail. Thin lines in the enamel, called stress markers, show periods when growth was interrupted by famine, by disease, by severe stress. Deep cavities tell you how much sugar or starch a person's diet contained. Abrasion patterns hint at what kind of food they were eating and how it was processed. Coarse stone-ground grain, gritty with microscopic sand, leaves a different signature than soft-boiled porridge. Even healed fractures have stories. A broken limb that mended straight tells you someone had enough support to rest, to be fed, to be cared for until they could walk again. Multiple healed injuries, layered over a lifetime, suggest a world where risk and accident were constant companions, and where social networks might have been strong enough to pull injured people through. Skulls show evidence of violence, cut marks from blades, depressed fractures from clubs or stones. But they also show surgery, trepanation holes carefully cut and somehow survived, bone regrowing along the edges. In those silent crania you glimpse not just cruelty or conflict, but also experimentation, courage, and attempts at healing. From the outside, all of that might look like a jumble of old bones. From the inside, it's a record of diet, workload, trauma, inequality, care. One village cemetery can reveal whether people were well fed or stunted, whether some enjoyed softer lives while others broke their backs, whether women and men carried similar burdens or sharply divided ones. And bones don't only tell you what someone did. With the right tools, they whisper where someone has been. Every mouthful of food, every sip of water carries tiny chemical signatures from the place it came from. Those signatures build up in our tissues. Long after we die, some of them remain. These are the stable isotopes, versions of common elements like carbon, nitrogen, strontium, and oxygen that differ just enough in mass to be distinguishable, but not enough to decay away like radioisotopes. Carbon and nitrogen in bone collagen are especially talkative about diet. Different plants follow slightly different photosynthetic pathways, and those leave different carbon isotope ratios. Animals higher on the food chain, eating lots of meat or fish, show distinct nitrogen signatures compared to people living mostly on plants or dairy. So, from a pinch of powdered bone you can estimate whether a population relied more on grazing animals, on river fish, on millet or wheat or maize. You can see shifts over time, the moment when more meat appears on the menu, or when a new crop becomes important. You can even track the arrival of farming into a region that once lived by hunting and gathering. Strontium plays a different role. It follows geology. Rocks in different regions have subtly different strontium isotope ratios. Those ratios pass into local plants, into grazing animals, into people. Tooth enamel, which forms in childhood and doesn't remodel, locks in the isotope pattern of the place where that child grew up. Compare enamel to the local strontium map, and you can tell whether a person was native to the region where they were buried or came from somewhere else. Do this for many individuals and patterns emerge, young women moving into a community from afar, or young men, or both, long-distance migration streams, intermarriage networks that spanned valleys, mountains, sometimes whole seas. Oxygen isotopes, shaped by rainfall and temperature, refine the picture further, offering hints about climate and altitude. Put together, these chemical clues turn bones into passports, diet logs, and travel records all in one. Even when all the buildings of a town are gone, its people can still line up and tell you, "We ate this, we worked like this, we married out, we brought strangers in." But people weren't eating in a vacuum. To understand daily life, you need to know the plants under their feet, the fields around their houses, the foods that filled their pots. This is where archaeobotany steps in. The study of ancient plant remains. You might imagine granaries full of grain, baskets still brimming with nuts and dried fruit, and sometimes in the most extraordinary conditions that happens. More often, what survives are specks. Pollen grains, produced in enormous quantities by trees and grasses, settle into lake mud, peat, and soil. Their outer walls are tough. Under a microscope, each kind of plant has its own distinctive shape and ornamentation. Layer by layer, pollen cores reveal forests expanding and shrinking, grasslands giving way to fields, the arrival of cereal crops into a wild landscape. Phytoliths, tiny silica bodies formed within plant cells, last even longer. Grasses, reeds, palms, many cultivated plants leave these microscopic glassy ghosts behind when their soft tissues decay. Different species have differently shaped phytoliths. Sweep sediments from an ancient floor, and you might find the outlines of harvested straw, chopped fodder, weaving fibres, or the remains of a thatched roof. Then there are starch grains trapped in the pits and crevices of stone tools and ceramic vessels. Wash a grinding stone that hasn't been touched in 4,000 years. Spin the water down, stain the residue, and slide it under a microscope. Suddenly, grains of wheat, barley, millet, maize, tubers, each with its own characteristic form, come into focus. Some show damage from cooking or fermentation. From those traces you can reconstruct recipes, porridges, breads, beers, stews. You can see when wild plants gave way to domesticated ones, when new crops appeared, when old ones faded. None of this looks dramatic from a distance. It's just dust, smears, and sparkles of silica. But it tells you what people were planting, harvesting, storing, and eating day after day. Many of the richest archives of this microscopic world are not noble tombs or sacred temples. They're trash, ancient rubbish heaps, middens, build up as generations throw out ash, broken pottery, bones, shells, plant peelings, worn tools. Layer upon layer of discards accumulates, sometimes meters thick. In dry or waterlogged conditions, those dumps freeze countless small acts of daily life in place. A single midden can hold the leftovers of thousands of meals. Charred seeds reveal which plants were regularly brought into the household. Cut marks on animal bones show which species were butchered, which parts were eaten, which were fed to dogs or tossed away. Burned dung tells you what animals were kept nearby and what they grazed on. Latrines, where they survive, are even more direct. Human feces can preserve parasite eggs, giving a grim but precise record of disease burdens. Pollen and seeds that passed through the digestive system document what people actually swallowed, not just what they grew. In some cases, intact insect remains and even tiny fish bones add further texture. It's not glamorous, but it is intimate. Through garbage pits and toilets, we step closer to how people really lived, what they ate in lean seasons, what made them sick, how closely they lived with their animals, how clean their water was. Of course, these methods have limits. Not every environment preserves bones equally well. Acidic soils can dissolve skeletons. Tropical heat and moisture can obliterate pollen and starch. Fires that char a few grains just enough to make them durable can also reduce many more to ash. The picture we reconstruct is always uneven, always biased by where preservation happened to be kind. And when it comes to human remains, another layer of complexity appears: ethics. Skeletons are not just data. They are people's ancestors, embedded in living traditions and beliefs. Modern archaeology operates at its best under frameworks of consent, consultation, and sometimes repatriation, returning remains to descendant communities for reburial or other forms of respectful care. That means some questions we could in theory answer stay unanswered, because communities choose that path. The silence in those cases is deliberate, and it has to be respected. Even where study is permitted, there are choices to make. How much sampling is justified? How much of a fragile bone or tooth can be ground away for isotopes or DNA? Each decision weighs the potential knowledge against the irreversible loss of material. So when we talk about bones and seeds and isotopes speaking, it's worth remembering we are listening to the parts that time and people have allowed to survive and to be examined. Still, within those constraints, the tiny evidence is powerful. In many parts of the world, there are no monuments, no standing stones, no written records, no palaces. Just low mounds in fields, or nothing visible at all. Yet a scatter of teeth and ribs can sketch a population's health. A handful of charred grains can date the first appearance of farming in a valley. A few grams of bone powder can show that a girl buried in a distant land grew up by a different sea. Parasite eggs in a latrine can tell you that city drains once overflowed, spreading disease through crowded streets. The great silence of the past is not absolute. It's perforated. Through those pinholes, those microscopic clues, we glimpse enough to know that under every quiet hillside, on every eroded terrace, lives were complex. People worked, ate, argued, loved, raised children, suffered illnesses, recovered from injuries, told stories, and dreamed. The big structures can vanish. The written words can rot away. But the human body, the plants it relied on, and the invisible chemistry of a lifetime have their own ways of leaving marks. From there, another kind of trace emerges, even fainter, even harder to capture, not just what people were and what they ate, but who they were connected to across distances and generations. To follow that trail, you have to go inside the molecules themselves. Inside those molecules, another archive waits. Not in the shape of bones or the pattern of wear on teeth or the chemistry of last meals. Deeper, in the long chains of DNA still hiding inside some of those old cells. Most of the time, it's gone. Heat, moisture, bacteria, time itself, they all chew away at genetic material. Within a few thousand years in most environments, DNA breaks into pieces so small and so scrambled that nothing useful is left. But not always. In cold caves, in permafrost, in very dry, stable sediments, some scraps survive, trapped in the dense tissue of a tooth root, or the thick part of a skull bone, or even in the soil that soaked up bodily fluids as a body decayed. This is ancient DNA, often just a few % of the total DNA in a sample, mixed in with microbes, roots, and modern contamination. But with modern techniques, those fragments can be filtered, compared, aligned. The result is not a face, not a memory, but a pattern of genetic variants. From those patterns, something astonishing appears. Relationships. You can line up individuals from a cemetery and see who was closely related to whom, parent and child, siblings, cousins. You can see whether people buried together were biological kin, or whether family in that place meant something else, grounded more in social ties than in shared ancestry. Zoom out, and relationships broaden into populations. Compare hundreds of ancient genomes from different times and places, and you can watch whole groups appear, expand, blend, and fade. You see traces of population bottlenecks, times when numbers crashed and diversity narrowed, like the one your distant ancestors survived 900,000 years ago. You see later expansions, where a few lineages suddenly spread across continents. Ancient DNA reveals admixture, mixing between once distinct groups. Instead of guessing from skull shapes or tool styles, geneticists can now say with some confidence that people related to one population moved into the territory of another, had children with them, and left descendants who carry both ancestries. Layer enough samples through time, and you can watch waves of movement roll across landscapes. Not lines on a map in a textbook, but gradual shifts in ancestry over centuries and millennia. A valley that once held people genetically close to one region begins, layer by layer, to fill with people whose genomes are partly from somewhere else. Plains that seemed archaeologically to show continuity reveal, genetically, a quiet replacement or fusion. Ancient DNA also whispers of contacts that left barely any trace in artifacts. A few individuals in an otherwise local cemetery might carry genetic signatures from far away. A child whose grandparents came from another climate, another language group, another way of life. Not hordes, not invasions. Just the slow, constant weaving of human movement. Sometimes it reveals disease. Within those same teeth and bones, fragments of ancient pathogens have been found. Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, Mycobacterium tuberculosis, ancient hepatitis viruses. They show up as tiny scraps of non-human DNA, matching known disease genomes. With them, we can start to map when certain epidemics first appeared in human history and how they moved. But it's important to notice where these miracles happen and where they don't. Ancient DNA preserves best in cold, dry, or stable environments. That means high latitudes, mountain caves, permafrost, some deserts. It preserves terribly in many of the places humans have lived longest and most densely, tropical rainforests, humid river valleys, warm coastal plains, acidic soils, repeated wetting and drying, intense heat. These dissolve DNA fast. So the famous ancient genomes, the studies that make headlines, cluster. A lot of Europe, a fair amount of high, dry regions in Asia, some Andean and North American remains, pockets of better preserved material in parts of Africa and the Near East, much less from the humid tropics, from huge stretches of Africa, from Southeast Asia's lowlands, from many island societies. The map of where we have ancient DNA is not the map of where history happened. It's the map of where chemistry has been kind and where modern politics and ethics allow sampling. That bias matters. When you see a colourful diagram of ancient ancestry components shifting through time, it's easy to forget that whole continents may be represented by only a few dozen individuals, or none at all, over thousands of years. That's why ancient DNA can't stand alone. On its own, a genome tells you about relatedness and mixture. It can say this person had ancestors from here and there. It can place them on a branching tree of populations, estimate when different groups diverged, when they began mixing again. But it cannot tell you what language they spoke. It cannot tell you what gods they worshipped, what stories they told at night, how they organized their households, whether they saw themselves as us against them, or as one tiny lineage in a web of relatives. For that, you still need archaeology. Houses, tools, graves, food remains, art. You still need linguistics, the slow reconstruction of language families, the tracking of words for crops or technologies as they spread from tongue to tongue. You still need oral traditions, histories, ethnography, the records of how communities explain themselves. When all three cross-check each other, genes, things and words, the picture is richest. Ancient DNA might show a sudden influx of people from the north into a region. Archaeology might reveal new house styles and burial customs at the same time. Linguistics might suggest that a new language branch entered around then. Together, they hint at a migration or a conquest or a peaceful blending. But even then it's a hint, not a security camera recording. There are risks in forgetting this. It can be tempting to equate genetic ancestry with identity, to speak of replacement as if one set of people simply erased another, to colour maps in blocks and arrows and imagine tidy DNA tribes marching across empty space. Human lives are messier. A population's genetic signature can change, because a few individuals from elsewhere had many descendants, not because millions of locals vanished. Genes can move without languages changing as small groups marry in. Languages can spread without major gene flow as trade networks, prestige or power persuade people to switch tongues. Culture does not follow DNA in a straight line. When we talk about Neanderthal ancestry or Denisovan ancestry in modern humans, we're talking about tiny percentages of genetic material, not hidden identities waiting to wake up. When we talk about ancient farmers moving into hunter-gatherer lands, we're talking about probabilities and averages, not uniform experiences. Ancient DNA excels at certain questions: who was related to whom and how closely? When did major population splits and mixtures occur? Did certain diseases arrive earlier than we thought? Were the people buried in this cemetery largely local, or did they include newcomers with very different ancestries? It can show contact zones where different lineages met and had children. It can reveal surprising continuity where genetics says, despite all the changes in pottery and architecture, the same basic population has been here for thousands of years. But it struggles with others. Why did a language family expand? What did people call themselves? How did they understand outsiders? What did migration feel like on the ground to the individuals who move? As more ancient genomes are sequenced, stories we thought we knew shift. Great migrations sometimes dissolve into multiple small overlapping movements. Regions that seem stable suddenly show pulses of change. A population once thought to vanish turns out to leave descendants in unexpected places. Models are revised, then revised again as a single new sample from a cave or a burial mound changes the best fit scenario. The silence of the past becomes patchy noise, little bursts of clarity surrounded by static. And that's where humility comes in. Ancient DNA has redrawn our maps of human history in just a couple of decades. It has confirmed some suspicions, overturned others, and opened whole new questions. But it has not, and cannot, render archaeology or linguistics obsolete. It cannot, and should not, be the only voice we listen to. At night, when you imagine those long-vanished people, their genomes are only one aspect of who they were. They were also storytellers, negotiators, rivals, friends. Their sense of belonging might have hinged on a river, a clan name, a shared ritual, not on any pattern we can see in their DNA. The deeper we look into bones and molecules, the more we find. Yet the more we find, the more we realize how much still lies beyond our reach. To chase those missing parts, the buried towns, the drowned coasts, the paths of people we've never sampled, you have to climb higher, not deeper. Step back from the microscope and look down at the earth itself. From far enough away, the ground starts telling on itself. Fields that look ordinary from eye level show faint rectangles when you rise above them. A forest that seems like one continuous green blanket hides straight lines, right angles, patterns that don't belong to roots or rivers. That is where the silence begins to thin. The most dramatic examples come from places that ought to be impossible to map. Deep jungle, high canopy, places where you can walk within meters of a buried city and never suspect it's there. Lidar changes that. Lidar, light detection and ranging, fires millions of laser pulses from a plane or satellite down through the air. Most bounce off the leaves at the top of the forest, but a small fraction slips through gaps, hitting branches, understory, and finally the ground. Each returning pulse is timed with ridiculous precision. Light moves fast, but we can measure it. From that timing, you get distance. From millions of distances, you get a three-dimensional cloud of points. The magic happens when you strip away everything that isn't ground. Mathematically, you can tell the difference between a point on a tall tree crown and a point on the soil below. Filter out the higher returns, smooth the rest, and suddenly the invisible becomes visible. Terraces, roads, canals, house platforms, walls. The low, rounded shapes of burial mounds. The sharp, geometric outlines of pyramids and plazas. In Central America, Lidar has revealed that what looked like isolated Maya centers were actually nodes in dense networks, cities joined by causeways, surrounded by massive agricultural landscapes. In parts of Southeast Asia, it has turned single temples in the jungle into neighborhoods in vast planned urban regions. None of this was obvious on the ground. Roots, vines, and later construction had erased the lines to human eyes. But the Earth still remembered in micrometers of height difference. Lidar just asked more carefully. Forests, though, are only one kind of cover. Sometimes what hides a past landscape is not leaves, but scale. You can stand in the middle of an ancient field system and see only random hedges and ditches. Climb high enough, and those same hedges trace out regular grids, fossilized geometry from centuries ago. Satellite imagery has turned that trick into a constant, quiet surveillance of the past. Some of the best discoveries come not from spectacular high-resolution photos, but from long series of modest images. When you stack them over time, let computers hunt for patterns in color, moisture and texture, things emerge. Buried walls and roads can change how crops grow above them. Shallow ditches hold more water after rain. Old stone foundations dry out faster. To a person on the ground, the field just looks patchy. To a satellite, It's a ghost map. Archaeologists trace faint lines of greener wheat that curve where no modern track runs and realize they are following a Roman road. They see darker rectangles in ploughed fields that, year after year, grow slightly differently from the soil around them, and those rectangles match the footprints of vanished houses. Sometimes the patterns are stranger, concentric rings of tiny mounds across a savanna, long, ruler straight ridges marching across tundra. These geoglyphs and raised fields hint at large-scale landscape engineering by societies that left few stone monuments, few texts. From space, you can also look not at the land, but at change. Floodplains shifting course, coastlines creeping, lakes shrinking and expanding. Layer human traces on top of this movement, and you begin to see why some places fell silent, their harbour silted up, their river moved away, their fertile soils eroded. The quiet is not always from absence of people. Sometimes it's from the land repeatedly rearranging the archive. But there are limits to looking from above. At some point you need to know what lies beneath the surface, and you'd rather not dig up an entire valley to find out. That is where geophysics comes in. Ground-penetrating radar GPR sends radio waves down into the earth and listens for echoes from buried layers. Different materials, soil, stone, void, bounce the signal back in different ways. Move the antenna back and forth in a grid, process the data, and you get slices through the ground, like a low-resolution CT scan of the first few meters of history. Walls appear as linear anomalies. Ditches show up as broad, softer zones. Graves, pits, ancient floors, even old river channels all leave their own signatures. Magnetometry listens instead to how the Earth's magnetic field is distorted by what's underground. Burning alters the magnetic properties of soil and brick. Fill a ditch with rubbish, ash and pottery, and its magnetism won't match the untouched subsoil beside it. A magnetometer can map those differences as a set of contours and blotches that, to a trained eye, spell out street, house, kiln, enclosure. Electrical resistivity, seismic methods and other techniques add more layers of contrast. Each method has its own strengths and blind spots, its own kinds of static. Used together, they can trace entire buried settlements, field systems, cemeteries without turning a single spade. Non-invasive, but not all-knowing. Because if a radar anomaly looks like a rectangle, you still don't know whether it's a tomb, a cellar, a shrine, or a modern drainage pit until someone checks. And then there is the largest archive of all, mostly out of reach, the sea. When the last ice age ended, global sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Continental shelves that had been dry land, broad plains, river valleys, coastal marshes, were slowly drowned. For most of human history, those were prime places to live. Now they are underwater. To glimpse them, scientists use sonar and bathymetry. Multi-beam sonar ships send fans of sound down to the sea floor. As the pulses bounce back, instruments record depth at thousands of points beneath the vessel. Sweep back and forth, and you build up a detailed map of underwater hills, valleys and scarps. On that submerged terrain you sometimes see shapes that don't quite fit. Old river channels carved when the land was dry, terraces that could have been ancient shorelines, oddly regular ridges that might be fish traps, causeways or drowned walls. Side-scan sonar doesn't focus on depth as much as texture, how rough or smooth the bottom is. In that grainy acoustic light, shipwrecks stand out as sharp-edged shadows. So do piles of stone, timbers, debris fields. A lost harbour can reappear as a tangle of lines and lumps radiating from a long silted basin. In shallow waters, divers and underwater archaeologists can visit these ghost landscapes and structures. In deeper seas, remotely operated vehicles take their place, cameras peering into the dark where people once lived at sea level. But even here, even with lasers, radar, magnetometers and sonar, Finding is not the same as knowing. A Lidar survey can tell you there is a pyramid under the trees. It cannot by itself tell you who built it, why they chose that exact spot, what rituals filled its steps. A satellite can show you the outlines of a vanished town. It cannot tell you whether its people thrived or scraped by, whether they farmed for themselves or tithed to a distant lord. Geophysics can map a cemetery's extent, but not decode grief. Sonar can sketch the husk of a ship resting on the seabed, but not narrate the storm, the battle, the quiet leak that slowly doomed it. For that, the old, slower tools are still needed. Excavation, careful recording of layers, sorting and dating of pottery and bones, the patient cross-checking with texts, oral traditions, environmental data. The new technologies are searchlights, not time machines. They shrink the silence by telling us where to listen more closely, where the ground or the seafloor is holding secrets. They multiply the number of questions we can ask. They show that in many places we once thought empty, the past is simply faint, blurred, overwritten by forests, fields or waves. But they will never erase the quiet entirely. There will always be sites too eroded, too disturbed, too deep, too altered to yield their stories. There will always be traces made of wood and words and feelings that no sensor can register. What these tools really reveal is not a complete past, but a more intricate one, a planet laced with half-visible paths, drowned villages, buried fields, forgotten walls, enough to remind us that the apparent emptiness of those 30,000 years is, in many cases, just a failure of our instruments and methods. And as our ways of looking improve, so does our obligation to be cautious, to remember that every bright new image, every ghostly map, is an invitation to wonder, not a final answer. In that widening, flickering light, the great silence becomes less a blank and more a murmur. A low, continuous background of lives and landscapes we're only just beginning to hear. Silence, then, is not a verdict, it's a condition. It's what you get when fragile things meet deep time, when low numbers of people cross a planet that keeps rearranging its own surface. It's the default outcome when wood decays, when skin rots, when stories are spoken instead of carved into stone. So when we peer into those apparently empty stretches, the quiet centuries on a chart, the long gaps between datable layers, it helps to remember that the quiet is mostly ours. It reflects what tends to survive, what we know how to detect, what we've chosen to look for so far. It does not necessarily reflect what people were capable of or how complex their lives might have been. That doesn't mean there were hidden global empires with satellites and skyscrapers wiped entirely from the record. The physics and chemistry of the planet don't really allow that. Industrial-scale mining, fossil fuel burning, large amounts of concrete and plastic, global transport of materials, they leave chemical and geological fingerprints that last for hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. We would see those signals in ice cores, in sediments at the bottom of lakes and seas. They aren't there. What is far more likely, almost guaranteed by simple probability, is that there were countless communities, cultures, maybe even modest regional networks that we simply haven't found yet, or have found only in the faintest, most ambiguous ways. Think of how much of Earth's land we've only skimmed in terms of systematic archaeology. Vast stretches of steppe, forest, savanna, upland plateau have never been surveyed carefully. Much of the seafloor that used to be dry land has barely been mapped in detail. Even in well-studied regions, construction, farming, and erosion have destroyed unknown numbers of sites before anyone knew they were there. When you fold all that together, the silence stops looking like an empty room and starts looking more like a library where only a few shelves are lit. We can read what the light falls on. The rest is still there, but we're guessing its contents from scattered pages. This is where imagination can both help and mislead. It's tempting to fill the dark with grand cinematic possibilities, lost super-civilizations with technologies equal to or beyond our own, wiped out so cleanly that they leave no trace. These stories are fun, and they press on a real feeling, the sense that the past is deeper and stranger than the textbooks admit. But they also skip over a basic rule that scientists quietly live by. The bigger the claim, the clearer the evidence has to be. If someone proposes a small local farming village that left almost nothing behind, the bar is modest. A few post holes, some pollen grains from cultivated plants, a cluster of storage pits, that's enough. It fits easily within what we already know. If someone proposes continent-spanning civilizations with advanced metal industries and global trade before the ones we've already documented, the bar rises. You'd expect to see large-scale quarries, metal slag in river sediments, unusual pollution layers, engineered landscapes on a vast scale. Without such anchors, the idea stays in the realm of speculation. Not impossible in the strict sense, just unsupported. Extraordinary claims don't get thrown out. They get put on a shelf labelled, maybe, someday, if, and we keep looking. If the evidence catches up, the shelf label changes. In the meantime, there is plenty of wonder to be found in the things we know we don't know. We still don't have a complete map of how humans moved across the globe. The broad strokes are there, out of Africa, into Asia, into Australia, into Europe, into the Americas, but the details twist and fork. Did people reach the Americas only once, or in multiple waves? How early did they travel along coasts, skimming the edges of continents in boats, leaving few traces inland? How many lineages flickered out without leaving descendants we can now sample? Language is another vast question mark. We can reconstruct family trees of known languages back a few thousand years. We can infer that at some point, our ancestors developed the kind of flexible, recursive language we now take for granted. But when exactly? Was there a single turning point, or a slow accumulation of small cognitive shifts? Did Neanderthals and Denisovans have comparable spoken languages, with grammar and metaphor and myth? The archaeological record, as we've seen, hints but doesn't settle it. Then there is social complexity, how and when it thickened. We can see large settled communities in several parts of the world by about 10 or 11,000 years ago. We can see monumental architecture, coordinated labour, long-distance trade. But exactly how power, status and inequality emerged inside those systems is much harder to read. Were there long periods where people lived in big, organised settlements without formal kings or rigid hierarchies? Did inequality appear, disappear, and then reappear in cycles rather than as a one-way staircase? Some recent discoveries suggest just that. Large sites with impressive buildings, but surprisingly even treatment in burials, followed centuries later by the first really ostentatious graves. Each new find nudges these timelines. A village that turns out to be centuries older than expected. A skeleton in a place no one thought people had reached yet. A piece of art in a style that forces a rethink of who influenced whom. Sometimes a single radiocarbon date or strand of ancient DNA can rewrite an entire region's story. The neat, textbook narratives, first this, then that, always in this order, begin to fray under the weight of messy details. Agriculture doesn't appear once and spread smoothly. It starts, stalls, gets abandoned, is reinvented. Urban life doesn't emerge in a single cradle of civilization. It bubbles up in parallel places, for different reasons, with different fates. It can be unsettling, this constant revision. The ground under the story keeps shifting just as the actual ground did, but there is a kind of calm available in accepting that. Deep history is not a puzzle we will one day finish. It's more like listening to a piece of music when half the notes have been lost. You catch melodies, you infer missing phrases, you imagine harmonies that might have been there. Humility in this context means holding our explanations lightly, remembering that our favourite theories are, at best, the best fits to the fragments we have right now, that our instruments filter what we see, that where the record is thin, multiple stories could fit. Open questions are not failures, they are invitations. Each gap is a place where someone, someday, might dig a trench, run a scan, or re-examine a forgotten box of artefacts, and find something that changes how we picture those quiet millennia. And responsible wonder sits between dismissal and credulity. It lets you feel the strangeness of those 30,000 years without rushing to fill them with impossible machines. It lets you imagine lives and landscapes richer than the surviving scraps suggest, while still anchoring that imagination in what we know about climate, biology, physics, and the stubborn, patient ways that matter decays. If you can rest there, aware of the silence, aware of its causes, aware of how partial our hearing is, then the past becomes less like a solved story and more like a night sky. Most of the stars are too faint to see with the naked eye. Some are hidden behind dust. Some light hasn't reached us yet. But what you can see is enough to know there is more. Enough to make you look up and keep looking, even when most of the sky is dark. So as you drift here near the end of the story, you can start to see why those 30,000 quiet years look the way they do. It isn't that people weren't there. It's that most of what they made, did, and felt was built out of things that do not like to last. Wood and hide, basketry and cord, mud and thatch and bone. Painted skin instead of painted walls. Stories told by firelight instead of carved in stone. All of that belongs to the fast cycle of matter. It grows, it's used, and then it goes back to soil and air. That's perishability. Then you stack time on top of that. Not a few lifetimes. Not a few 100 years of city history. Tens of thousands of seasons, storms, freezes, thaws, roots prying into cracks, worms and bacteria eating their way through everything they can touch. Rivers shift, coasts erode, floodplains bury old surfaces meters deep. Wind strips hilltops and piles the dust somewhere else. Whole landscapes tilt and fold as the crust adjusts and grinds. Sea level rises and calmly drowns the places where people once walked, talked, and buried their dead. That's landscape change and submergence. And on top of that, there is the simplest filter of all. We have barely looked. Most of the planet has never had a careful survey. Most potential sites have never been excavated. Sampling is thin, patchy, biased toward places where modern people live, build and fund research. A site covered by a forest, a desert, or the sea gets skipped, not because nothing is there, but because it's hard to get to. When you put all of those together, fragile materials, restless ground, drowned shorelines, deep time and sparse sampling, you get exactly the pattern we see. Not a clean, continuous story, a flicker, a scatter of durable things that happen to fall into protected corners. Stone, bone, fired clay, metal, lime, structures that happen to collapse in ways that preserved rather than erased. Burials in dry caves, wells that filled with trash instead of silt, shipwrecks pinned under anoxic mud. The rest goes through what we kept circling back to, the archaeological filter. Everything humans ever did on Earth passes through it, through chemistry and physics, through erosion and decay, through what gets buried and what gets broken, through where we happen to dig and what tools we happen to use. Only a fraction makes it to the other side, into museums and papers and documentaries. And that fraction is skewed. It's a survivorship bias of the deepest kind. Durable stuff made in certain ways, in certain settings, is vastly overrepresented. Fragile, small-scale, low-impact ways of living are underrepresented even if they lasted much longer and involved far more people. So when we talk about the record, what we really mean is what has survived the filter so far and what we have noticed. The hopeful part is that the filter is not fixed. In the last few decades, our toolbox for listening to the quiet parts of history has become much more sensitive. We cannot recover everything. Most of what has gone is truly gone, but we can hear more faint notes than ever before. Microscopy lets us see use wear on flint, plant fibres in dental plaque, pigment grains on tools that once scraped, painted hides. Isotope chemistry in bones and teeth tells us about diets, weaning age, mobility. Ancient DNA, where it survives, traces lineages and mixtures invisible to the naked eye. Remote sensing lifts our view off the ground. Satellites and aerial photographs pick up subtle differences in vegetation and soil colour that hint at buried walls and ditches. Lidar strips away forests in the data, revealing forgotten field systems, road networks, whole cities under the canopy. Sonar and sub-bottom profilers map drowned river valleys and old shorelines on the continental shelves. Geophysics lets us see into the ground without cutting it. Magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity. They all work in different ways, but together they can sketch the outlines of vanished buildings, enclosures and pits, sometimes in astonishing detail. None of this gives us a complete recovery, it never will. But it changes the balance between silence and sound. It fills in some of the long, flat lines with tiny spikes, new sites, older dates, new clues about how people lived in those apparently empty stretches. It also keeps reminding us that every final story is provisional. What looks like a clean absence can become a presence with one new method, one new survey, one new excavation in the right spot. The dark shelves of the library are not staying dark out of malice. We just haven't found all the light switches yet. So as you lie here letting the edges of the story blur, there is a gentle way to hold all this. You can picture those 30,000 years, and really the hundreds of thousands around them, not as a blank, but as a crowded, intricate landscape that our instruments barely graze. There were fires tonight, and every night, small flames in caves, on riverbanks, in windbreaks of branches and turf. There were arguments and jokes, births and illnesses, careful craft and clumsy mistakes. People woke to frost, to monsoon rain, to dry winds over open steppe. They navigated by stars we still recognize. Most of that will never have a label, a site number, a place in a textbook. And that's okay. Not because it's unimportant, but because that is how deep time treats almost everything. Human, animal, plant, stone. What survives is a sparse sample. What doesn't survives only as influence, genes passed on, techniques modified and remembered, paths worn into geography, and then erased again. Respectful curiosity lives in that space. It asks, given the fragments we have, what can we responsibly infer? Where do we need to admit we don't know? Which possibilities are anchored in climate, geology and biology, and which float free, more like stories than hypotheses? It accepts that some questions will stay open. What exactly people sang in a given valley 25,000 years ago? What metaphors they used for death? How they named the constellations? Which jokes made them laugh so hard they couldn't breathe? Those are gone in any literal sense, but knowing they existed can still change how we feel when we look at the gaps. It means that when the record goes quiet, we don't have to choose between dismissing those centuries as empty or filling them with impossible machines. We can do something softer, acknowledge that they were full of lives, and then listen with the best tools we have without pretending we'll ever recover every note. As you drift towards sleep, you might let one small question float with you. It doesn't have to be grand, it could be as simple as, in those quiet centuries where the chart shows nothing, what did an ordinary morning sound like? Footsteps on packed earth, the crackle of kindling, someone humming out of habit. Or maybe which of the things you did today, some tiny gesture, will leave absolutely no trace in 10,000 years. and yet still mattered. You won't solve it tonight. You don't need to. You can just let your mind wander across those drowned coasts and buried valleys, across caves with ash long since blown away, knowing that even if the evidence is thin, the lives were thick with detail. If you're still awake enough to hear this last part, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Somewhere it's late evening. Somewhere else it's the middle of the night or very early morning. All those points on the globe, each with someone lying in the dark, thinking about the same long silence. If you found this calming, or it gave you something gentle to think about as you fall asleep, you can help this kind of quiet history reach more people. Tap like, leave a comment with your location and the time, and subscribe if you'd like more deep time stories to drift off to. The past will never stop being mostly silent, but together, slowly, patiently, we can keep listening to what remains, so that those few fragile traces keep speaking, just a little longer into the dark.